Hammer and Hoe. Alabama Communists during the Great Depression. Robin D. G. Kelley. Dedicated to the young people of Ferguson, St. Louis, Baltimore, Miami, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Oakland, Gaza and the West Bank, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, Dakar, Cairo, Ayotzinapa and Mexico City, Santiago, Athens, Lisbon, Madrid, and elsewhere, fighting for justice, democracy, peace, and an end to human misery. Preface to the 25th Anniversary Edition. Preface. Acknowledgements. Abbreviations. Prologue. Radical Genesis, Birmingham, 1870 to 1930. Part 1. The Underground, 1929 to 1935. 1. An Invisible Army, Jobs, Relief, and the Birth of a Movement. 2. In Egypt Land, the Sharecroppers' Union. 3. Violence. 4. Organize or Starve, Communists, Labor, and Anti-Radical. 5. In the Heart of the Trouble, Race, Sex, and the ILD. Negroes ain't black, but red-black communists, and the culture of opposition. Part 2. Up from Bolshevism, 1935 to 1939. 6. The Road to Legality, the Popular Front in Birmingham, 1935 to 1937. 7. The CIOs in Dixie. 8. 9. Old Slaves, New Deal, Communists, and the WPA. The Popular Front in Rural Alabama. 10. The Democratic Front. Part 3. Back to the Trenches, 1939 to 1941. 11. The March of Southern Youth. Epilogue. Fade to Black, the Invisible Army in War, Revolution, and Beyond. Notes. Bibliography. Index. Black Convict Laborers, Banner Mine, Alabama. Al Murphy. 24. 26. 35. 6. Hosea Hudson. Sharecropping Family, near Utah, Alabama. Lemon Johnson, SCU Secretary of Hope Hall, Alabama, Local. 58. 62. 66. 97. 98. 127. 45. Company Suburb. Clyde Johnson. Meat for the Buzzards. Anti-Communist Handbill distributed by the Ku Klux Klan. 75. Fight Lynch Terror. Smash the Barriers. District 17 Secretary Robert Fowler Hall. Sit Down Strike, American Casting Company, Birmingham, 1937. 162. 198. 204. 187. 145. Sharecroppers Union Membership Card. Eugene Bull Connor, Birmingham City Commissioner. League of Young Southerners. Ethel Lee Goodman. Segregated Audience in Montgomery awaits Henry Wallace, 1948. 229. Preface to the 25th Anniversary Edition. How is this for timing? The Post, Cold War, and the publication of Hammer and Hoe are both 25 years old. Or to put it another way, I published an entire book about the trials, tribulations, and virtues of a communist movement in the U.S. South just as communism, in its Soviet variety, at least, took its last breath. The demise of the USSR should have no bearing on the historical value of communism, but in the early 1990s, few conservative or liberal critics saw any reason to revisit communist movements besides performing an autopsy. Given how obsessed with the present our culture is, once communists ceased to be our greatest existential threat, they became, at best, relics of the past and, at worst, the 20th century's biggest losers. Yet I'd be lying if I said Hammer and Hoe was conceived as a purely academic contribution, unburdened by presentist concerns. The book's genesis cannot be understood absent an understanding of the political and personal context in which it was written. I felt a fierce urgency to study black working-class radicalism, not because the old Soviet states were crumbling in the face of revolt, but because the apartheid state of South Africa was succumbing to a massive multiracial movement, a movement in which left trade unions and the South African Communist Party played leading roles. Far more than the fall of the Berlin Wall, Nelson Mandela's release from prison and Namibian independence, both in 1990, best represented the politics behind this book. Even the title was inspired by events in Africa. In 1970, the People's Republic of the Congo, a self-declared Marxist-Leninist socialist state, adopted the symbol of a cross. Hammer and Hoe for its flag. 1. Coincidentally, the regime and its flag were replaced in 1992, another Cold War casualty. I had entered UCLA's graduate program in 1983 as an Africanist. Modern South Africa was my chosen field, and the ways in which black workers struggled under regimes of racial capitalism, how they resisted exploitation, what they fought for, how they came to define political liberation, was my primary obsession. For my doctorate, I planned to write a social history of black radical politics in South Africa that would be attentive to the culture and ideas of ordinary people. There was little indication that the 1980s would be the last decade of the Cold War. This was the era of Reaganism and Thatcherism, new imperialist wars, and new revolutions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, of capital flight, the erosion of the welfare state, neoliberal privatization schemes, the weakening of anti-discrimination laws and policies, of a wave of police and vigilante killings that struck our communities with the force of a cluster bomb. The decade, in fact, opened with police killings and non-lethal acts of police brutality emerging as a central political issue, resulting in a massive urban insurrection in Liberty City, Florida, in May 1980. The 1980s also witnessed genuine efforts by radicals to build multiracial solidarity in the unlikely realm of electoral politics. The election of Mayor Harold Washington in Chicago in 1983, along with Jesse Jackson's 1984 presidential bid, held the radical promise of rainbow coalition politics. At the same time, like many of my fellow students in the early to mid-1980s, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. By the time I set foot on UCLA's campus in the fall of 1983, the boycott and divestment movement against South Africa was in full swing. I was active in a sectarian party pursuing dreams of socialist revolution, elected president of UCLA's African Activists Association, and chaired the ad hoc committee to keep South Africa out of the Olympics, which were held in Los Angeles. 2. We were part of a broad coalition of students calling on the University of California to divest its holdings from South Africa. We built makeshift shantytowns on campus, sat in at the South African consulate, educated our community, built momentum, and by the summer of 1986 persuaded the UC Regents to divest their $3.1 billion worth of holdings from South Africa and Namibia. While we won that battle, none of my comrades believed divestment alone would topple apartheid and birth a new democratic state founded on the principles of the Freedom Charter. We knew that the struggle inside of South Africa mattered most. And given the experiences of Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Namibia, we knew it would be bloody. The United Democratic Front, the African National Congress, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, demonstrated the power of massive popular resistance, strikes, civil disobedience, the power of people to stop South Africa's racial regime from functioning. Though it may seem hard to believe now, these were revolutionary times, politically and theoretically. In the fog of negotiating movement work and schoolwork, I embraced a group of radical thinkers who believed another world was possible. C. L. R. James W. E. B. Du Bois, Walter Rodney, Amilcar Cabral, Manning Marable, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Angela Davis, Chinwezu, Vincent Harding, Cornel West, Barbara Smith, Stuart Hall, Edward Said, and Samir Amin, among others, wrote about the ravages of racial capitalism, the violence of patriarchy, the futility of parochial politics in the face of global imperialism. 3. But resistance to what end? I began to think about the persistent failure of socialist and communist movements to mobilize black people. And then I encountered Cedric Robinson's extraordinary book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, 1983, which exposed a fundamental fallacy in the way I framed. 4. It was never about a failing in the left's ability to mobilize black people but our conceptual failure to recognize a black radical tradition critical of, and illegible to, a Euro-American left formed by the logic of Western civilization. When this tradition found its way into left movements, in Africa, Latin America, even the United States, it brought its own unique vision, historical sensibility, and set of resistance strategies to the communist movement. In doing so, it altered the party. In other words, whereas most scholars set out to prove just how alien communism was to black people, Robinson compelled me to ask what black people, in this case, black South Africans, brought to the left to make it their own. The presumed objects of communist machinations became subjects and agents in making their own history. Taking my cue from Cedric Robinson, I published an essay in our graduate student-run journal, Ufahamu, on the Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA, arguing that a black radical tradition, rooted in earlier notions of African redemption, rural opposition to land dispossession, and expressions of working class and petit bourgeois African nationalism, had produced a demand for self-determination before the Communist International was formed. Unable to recognize African radicalism, white South African communists initially oriented their work toward the white working class. Imagine a communist party anywhere backing striking miners under the banner, "Workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa." When African trade unionists, as well as officials of the Communist International, Comintern, in Moscow, criticized party leaders for their uncritical support of the all-white Rand revolt in 1922 to the exclusion of the more numerous African miners' struggles, white South African communists made the absurd argument that the advanced white proletariat must win the fight for socialism first in order to free the entire 5. Predictably, the Comintern directed the CPSA to redirect its work toward the African masses. African and colored communists, who now constituted the party's majority, understood the directive to mean waging a mass struggle for African self-determination, sovereignty, massive land reform, and majority rule. White communists, on the other hand, interpreted the Comintern's resolution as a mandate to educate the backwards African working class to support a white-led proletarian revolution. The idea of a white-led proletarian revolution in South Africa was doomed from the start, as the 1922 Rand revolt demonstrated, and the African, colored, and Indian comrades knew it. But since whites still held the reins of the CPSA, non-white communists depended on the Comintern to lay down the law, as it were. Although I had concluded that the Comintern played a key role in enforcing the demand for African self-determination, the essay's central contribution, I think, was to turn the usual claim that the communists had infiltrated the African nationalist movement on its head. Rather, the nationalists infiltrated the Communist Party, adopted a radical vision of self-determination that recognized South Africa as a settler colonial state, and demanded the return of land and black majority rule, expressed as an independent native South African republic with full equal rights for all races. This article, despite its overly rigid formulations and archival limitations, planted the seeds for Hammer and Hoe. I extended my proposed thesis to include the U.S. South, hoping to produce a comparative study of black radicalism and the communist left in two global industrial cities, Johannesburg and Birmingham, Alabama. Without going into the messy details, let me just say that the project was always untenable since I had no prospect of getting into South Africa and therefore no access to the necessary archives. In 1985, the year my dissertation prospectus was approved, President P. W. Botha declared a state of emergency, making travel to South Africa all but impossible. And my participation in protests at the South African consulate in Beverly Hills did not bode well for my visa application. I ended up dropping the South African component, switching to U.S. history, and focusing my research entirely on Alabama. The rest, as they say, is history. Nothing, either Nell Irvin Painter's magnificent The Narrative of Hosea Hudson, his life as a Negro communist in the South, 1979, nor black Marxism, fully prepared me for what I encountered in Alabama. The testimonies and memories, the archives, the very landscape constituted living proof that a political culture distinct from the Euro-American left and rooted in older Afro-Christian and black folk traditions dominated the Communist Party in Alabama. The overwhelming, startling evidence compelled me to leave a lot of my assumptions about Marxist-Leninist movement culture behind. Relying on police records, the local and national communist press, leaflets and handbills, oral histories, photographs, even a marked-up Bible, I found some dramatic episodes of armed sharecroppers fighting cops and landlords, interracial demonstrations in downtown Birmingham, and legal cases that transformed local injustices into international scandals. But I also found lots of small stories of how black communists made themselves and their movement visible when their lives depended on invisibility, by leaving their mark in wet concrete, by placing leaflets in trees, releasing them on the ground for the wind to distribute, hiding them in the laundry baskets of domestic workers going into their white comrades' homes, by sending and signed penny postcards to social workers and city relief agencies to demand more assistance and better treatment, by restoring a neighbor's electricity using jumper cables when he or she could not pay the bill, by playing the role of Sambo before a judge in order to escape a jail sentence. I wasn't prepared for characters such as Lemon Johnson, a former member of the communist-led Sharecroppers Union. In December 1986, I visited Johnson at his home in rural Montgomery County, which I described in my journal as a tiny, rundown shack with battered wooden walls, a rusted tin roof that had begun to cave in, and a porch stocked with 6. He fed me a huge lunch of collard greens, beans, Wonder Bread, fried chicken, and a slice of cake. We ate outside and talked for a while. When it became unbearably cold, we moved inside. I sat on his bed as he slouched in a wooden chair next to me. A faded picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was tacked to the wall above his head. He told stories about the 1935 cotton pickers' strike, Stalin's pledge to send troops to Mobile to help black sharecroppers if things got out of hand, and the night a well-armed group of women set out to avenge their comrades who had been beaten or killed during the strike. When I asked Mr. Johnson how the Union succeeded in winning some of their demands, without the slightest hesitation he reached into the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a dog-eared copy of V.I. Lenin's What Is to Be Done and a box of shotgun shells, set both firmly on the bed next to me, and said, "Right thar, theory and." 7. I spent nearly a year in the field, scouring archives all over the country, trying to piece together the history of a semi-underground movement that deliberately left few traces. Alabama communists succeeded so well, in fact, that several Southern historians did not believe there was enough evidence to warrant a dissertation, let alone a book. My dissertation ultimately weighed in at 698 pages. Besides, it seemed that parts of the story had been told elsewhere. Ned Cobb eloquently recounts the story of the Sharecroppers' Union in Theodore Rosengarten's 1974 oral narrative All God's Dangers. The life of Nate Shaw, and Nell Irvin Painter's The Narrative of Hosea Hudson captures the radical Democratic. 8. Painter and Rosengarten were able to draw out the psychic, social, and political costs of being a black radical in the Deep South. I had imagined the archetypal black communist as heroic and intellectually astute, delivering fiery street corner speeches and fighting cops as they drag evicted workers' furniture back into their homes. But this wasn't Hudson, not exactly. After I read Painter's book and interviewed him, Hudson reminded me of my grandfather from South Carolina, from his colloquial speech, his superstitions, and love of good gospel music to his constant refrain that he was probably right since so-and-so was dead and he was still living. This blew my mind and made me rethink what it meant, not just to be a communist, but a movement person who was poor, black, and intelligent, despite a lack of formal education. It profoundly shaped my view of the communist and working-class political culture in the South. His story was the greatest reminder that people are constantly in motion. They always have the potential for transformation, and participation in social movements is the prime catalyst. We see Hudson change before our very eyes, from a quiet, unassuming child of a sharecropper without much to look forward to a confident leader, powerful speaker, and Marxist-Leninist to boot. I'm indebted to Nell Painter, not only for her magnificent portrait of Hudson but for the care she took to read and critique early drafts of Hammer and Hoe. She, along with Mark D. Nazone, author of Communists in Harlem During the Depression, and Theodore and Dale Rosengarten, read the entire manuscript and offered invaluable advice and suggestions. Dale's 1969 Radcliffe College thesis on the history of the Alabama Sharecroppers Union paved the way for all subsequent research on the movement. Another scholar who followed in her footsteps and generously shared with me his findings and contacts was the Venerable Shinobu Yasuji, a Japanese historian who spent over a decade documenting the 9. Two scholars, in particular, helped me make sense of the Alabama Communist Party's distinctive political culture. First, by sheer coincidence, the late George Roig became a mentor to me in the spring of 1987. He had accepted a visiting position at UCLA just as I returned from the field and began writing my dissertation. Illness rendered him virtually immobile, so I volunteered to drive him to campus. 3 days a week I would guide him to the cafe in North Campus, secure his 2 cinnamon rolls and coffee, and sit with him for an hour or more. He schooled me in ways to interpret working-class movements, culture, and resistance, and introduced me to some of his groundbreaking essays such as The Historical Roots of Black Liberation, 1968, Notes on the American Working Class, 1968, and 10. By paying greater attention to Roig's concept of self-activity, I found that Alabama's communists opened up another world of politics since most of the people the party fought for did not join insurgent organizations. They fought back as individuals or groups, often using strategies intended to cover their tracks. Roig also insisted I read Class and Culture in Cold War America, A Rainbow at Midnight, by an incredible young historian named George Lipsitz. First published in 1981, the book offered a provocative and convincing thesis that the post-war period was not the death of labor's struggle but one of the most active, militant periods of working class. 11. Most importantly, he discovered in popular culture expressions of working class desire and developed a whole new way to analyze the cultures of aggrieved populations. I was hooked. Just a year later, in 1988, he published A Life in the Struggle, Ivory Perry and the Culture of Opposition, a brilliant biography of St. Louis organizer Ivory Perry that literally forced me to rewrite large sections of what by then had become Hammer and Hoe, the book manuscript. Lipsitz's argument that Ivory Perry was formed by and operated within a culture of opposition gave me the framework I needed to understand the local political culture and to help me see the Alabama communists and their supporters as 12. Once I did that, I could see the cultural and ideological basis of their own way of seeing alternatives to the status quo. I came to understand why the Bible was more important in challenging the dominant ideology than, say, Marx or Lenin. Thanks to the many readers acknowledged in the text, and my indefatigable team at UNC Press, notably Iris Tillman Hill, then editor-in-chief and the project's first champion, and my tireless and patient editor Louis Bateman, I forged these stories into a work of which I'm still quite proud. Garnering critical praise from historians and across disciplines, Hammer and Hoe won a couple of noteworthy book prizes, was the subject of roundtable discussions, and has been widely taught and cited. A passage from the book even turned up on the law school admission test. After 25 years, it is still in print. And while I've appreciated the professional recognition, I have been especially moved by the responses I've gotten from activists who read the book on their own or in study groups. Organizers from the Labor/Community Strategy Center, Los Angeles, Project South, Atlanta, standing together to organize a revolutionary movement, Storm, Bay Area, and the Miami Workers Center, to name a few, have all conveyed to me the valuable political lessons they took from the book. For example, young activists who often felt that divisions of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality were insurmountable, or assumed that identities determined political choices and alliances, learned that solidarity is a dynamic, often unpredictable process shaped inexorably by actual struggles in real time. Black working-class Alabamians did not join the Communist Party out of some economic calculation or because they were driven by narrow interest group politics. They were not fighting for themselves. They were fighting for each other, and for a fairer, less oppressive world for all. But the most illuminating lessons I took from the book came not from political activists but from a playwright. A little over 10 years ago, Hammer and Hoe inspired critically acclaimed author Naomi Wallace to write Things of Dry Hours, a powerful three-person play set in 1930s Birmingham. Tyce Hogan, an older, widowed, black communist leader, lives with his daughter Kelley, a domestic worker, and they suddenly find themselves having to give refuge to a young white comrade, wanted by the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Companies, TCI, private police. Wallace had completely absorbed every nuance, every argument, every detail in the book, and grasped what it meant to build a radical, interracial, working-class movement in the heart of the Deep South. She understood that violence, and even death, came with the territory. And yet she deliberately avoided the kinds of violent confrontations and public events I always thought were most dramatic. Instead, she brilliantly set the entire play inside Tyce Hogan's tiny shotgun house, transforming it into a secret refuge hidden in plain sight. We don't see the violence, or the protests, or the actual street organizing, but we know it's there. The virtually claustrophobic setting becomes a metaphor for the interior lives of Southern working people, black and white, radical and reactionary. Wallace succeeded in taking three characters and reconstructing the world I found so elusive, the complex story of how people struggled to find life, love, meaning, and connection under the incredible circumstances of building a revolutionary movement in the Jim Crow South. Things of Dry Hours does not dramatize the facts, but lays bare emotional truths, reveals what bubbles underneath the surface, in this case, love and desire. She revealed father-daughter love, in the context of building a new society in their heads, comradely love across the color line, sexual agency and terror. As we now know, all predictions that the end of the Cold War spelled the death of communist history proved premature. On the contrary, research and writing on the Communist Party USA, PUSA, have proliferated since. 13. One reason for the growing interest has been the opening of the Russian State Archive of Social and Political History, RGASPI, a consequence of the end of the Cold War. The availability of the Soviet archives has opened up new windows onto both local and international histories of communist parties, especially from the 14. For example, Glenda Gilmore's superb book, Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, 1919 to 1950, judiciously plumbs the Soviet archives to reveal how conversations in Moscow, New York, and South Africa influenced communist strategy in 15. Randy Storch's Red Chicago, American Communism at its Grassroots, 1928 to 35, creatively draws on the Soviet archives to paint a rich picture of daily work and political life among the 16. For this new edition of Hammer and Hoe, I considered incorporating the Soviet archival material, but what I found would not have changed my argument. The new material would have allowed me to flesh out certain stories, say a bit more about debates in the Soviet Union over the interpretation of self-determination, and quote some of the fascinating letters from District 17 leaders such as Ted Wellman or Nat Ross. This would have made the book bigger while leaving the essential narrative unchanged. I did make a few minor corrections where appropriate. Besides, upon rereading Hammer and Hoe in preparation for writing this introduction, I was struck by how much of the book focuses on the social and political history of Alabama working people, state violence, political economy, and the impact of federal New Deal policy. Party work was determined less by communist internal machinations than by the conditions on the ground. Besides, the availability of new archives does not fully explain the current fascination with the history of the Communist Party. Over the past 5 or 6 years, I've gotten more requests to talk about Hammer and Hoe than about any other book I've published. New study groups have resurrected it, organizers are discussing it again, and I've been told that a copy showed up at the Occupy Wall Street People's Library in Zuccotti Park. Once again, the political context matters. Renewed interest in Hammer and Hoe, in particular, is the result of the ravages of neoliberalism and the global economic crisis, on the one hand, and the growth of the carceral state and the latest wave of police killings, on the other. Anti-capitalism has become cool again, thanks to Occupy, the new hipsters and the share economy, the spectacular movement of Walmart and fast food workers across the country, and the recent publication of Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, 2014, which makes a compelling argument that in order to save the earth ravaged by corporate and state violence, we must end capitalism. At the same time, opposition to a racist criminal justice system has generated some of the largest, most sustained protests in years. The killing, corralling, caging, warehousing, expelling, firing, deporting, and outright killing of black and brown people continue unabated, ramping up, in fact, as declarations of racism's death grow louder and more confident. In our current moment, anti-capitalism and struggles against state violence and incarceration tend to be separate movements. For communists and their allies, especially in the Deep South, they were inextricably bound together. The characters in Hammer and Hoe devoted as much of their energy to defending black people swept into a racist criminal justice system, investigating and challenging lynching, and protesting police murders of unarmed black people, as to fighting evictions, demanding relief for the unemployed, and organizing trade unions. Let's begin with anti-capitalism. No matter what we might think of the Soviet Union in hindsight, or the communist or various socialist parties, in the 1930s social democracy and forms of socialism were considered legitimate alternatives to capitalism. Capitalism was not yet victorious, especially since radical workers and farmers' movements of the late 19th century were still part of a living national memory. Today labor unions are portrayed as corrupt, bloated, a drain on the economy, even as the American worker is being promoted as the most productive in the world, not because of unions but in spite of them. In our neoliberal age, economic debates focus not on alternatives to capitalism but on what kind of capitalism. Capitalism with a safety net for the poor or one driven by extreme free market liberalization. A capitalism in which the state's role is to bail out big banks and financial institutions, or one where the state imposes, or rather restores, greater regulation in order to avoid economic crises? In both of these scenarios, a weakened labor movement is a given. The once powerful unions are doing little more than fighting to restore basic collective bargaining rights and deciding how much they are going to give back. Union leaders are struggling just to participate in crafting austerity measures. Whereas in the New Deal era, the state's efforts to save capitalism centered on John Maynard Keynes's ideas, leading to massive expenditures in infrastructure, job creation, social safety nets like Social Security and unemployment insurance, paid by workers themselves, let's not forget, and certain protections for the right of unions to organize. All of these measures were made possible by a strong labor movement and unemployed movement. There was a level of militant organization that we did not see in our post-2008 collapse, in spite of Occupy Wall Street. While Occupy was massive, international, and built on pre-existing social justice movements, it lacked the kind of institutional power base and political clout that organized labor had in the 1930s. Hammer and Hoe not only reminds us that black and some poor white folks dreamed of socialist futures, but that the New Deal was a far cry from their vision of a just economy. It is hard to understand this in an era when progressives are struggling just to restore positive features of the New Deal welfare state. But as the book reveals, New Deal policies in Alabama were neither democratic nor inclusive. For most black rural and urban working people, the New Deal led to greater inequalities and outright dispossession. The New Deal's agricultural programs, for example, benefited landowners and landlords by federally subsidizing crop reductions. In theory, the money was supposed to be fairly distributed to tenant farmers and sharecroppers, but that never happened. Instead, the landlords kept the money, evicted the tenant farmers and sharecroppers from their land, and used the federal payments to hire them back as cheap wage laborers while investing in mechanical cotton pickers to eventually replace them. The party opposed evictions, demanded basic landlord-tenant rights and contracts, and fought for a decent wage for rural laborers. But the New Deal did not protect or recognize the rights of rural workers as labor under the National Industrial Recovery Act, Widener Act, and related legislation. Once the communists shifted from adversary to ally of the New Deal during the Popular Front, leftists such as Hosea Hudson and Henry O. Mayfield were swallowed up by the Congress of Industrial Organizations. CIO. The party practically ceased to function as an independent, autonomous organization. My suggestion that the Popular Front led to the party's demise in Alabama is still perhaps the book's most controversial argument. The Popular Front era, after all, was considered the party's heyday, when liberals and anti-fascists were willing to build alliances, and the PUS's leaders declared, "Communism 20th Century Americanism." To be fair, black communists were effective in their role as the left wing of the labor movement. They led the union's voter registration campaigns and fought to abolish the poll tax. However, the failure of the CIO's Operation Dixie, anti-communism within the AFL-CIO, not to mention the anti-communism of the NAACP, weakened or destroyed the communist-led unions, leaving an indelible mark on the next wave of civil rights activists and possibly arresting what may have been a broader economic and social justice agenda. But the communists hardly disappeared. For most African Americans, as well as black people all over the world, the party was best known for its defense of the Scottsboro Nine and the International Labor Defenses, ILD, unremitting challenge to a racist criminal justice system. This remains their legacy. In 2002, when Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Yusef Salaam, and Corey Wise, known collectively as the Central Park Five, were finally exonerated for the 1989 rape and beating of Tricia Mailey, I was invited on Democracy Now! And other talk shows to compare their case with Scottsboro. Some of the comparisons were strikingly obvious. The press demonized the defendants, calling the Scottsboro boys brutes, animals, and savages, just as the Central Park Five became known as a wolf pack. The press demonized the mothers, as well, blaming single parenting and dysfunctional families for their behavior. All of the defendants were between 14 and 15 years old. They were falsely convicted thanks to forced confessions, media hysteria, an overzealous prosecutor, and a long-standing racist discourse that presumes. 17. There was one fundamental difference, however, the presence of the left. The communists and the ILD transformed the local, and I might add common, injustice into an international cause célèbre by building a mass movement to free the Scottsboro Nine. 2 weeks after the arrest, the communists got 13,000 people to take to the streets of Cleveland to protest the Scottsboro frame-up. The very next day, they led a demonstration in New York City 20,000 strong. They formed Scottsboro defense committees all over the country, whose members flooded the Alabama governor's office with telegrams, letters, and postcards demanding freedom for the Scottsboro boys. They inspired mass meetings in Paris, Moscow, Johannesburg, London, and Tokyo, accusing the state of Alabama of planning a legal lynching. The communists argued that the defendants were not just innocent based on lack of evidence, but that they were victims of a racist and classist system. Most strikingly, they promoted representations of the defendants and the alleged victims that countered the racial and gendered stereotypes used by the state and white supremacists, e.g., that all black men are violent, dangerous rapists and all white women are pure, virtuous victims. Instead, they succeeded in doing something extraordinary. They reversed the poles of criminalization, turning young black men and young working-class white women into victims and the state into the criminal. It opened a path for thinking about incarcerated black people as class war prisoners. Scottsboro was not the only case. Alabama communists and the ILD were overwhelmed with local incidents of lynchings, police shootings, false arrests, even the rape of black women. Names that appear in these pages, such as Tom Robertson, Babe Dawes, Thomas Jasper, Ralph Gray, Willie Peterson, Dan Pippin Jr., Elmore, Honey, Clark, A.T. Hardin, and Dennis Cross, may not possess the historical weight of Ozzie Powell, Clarence Norris, Haywood Patterson, or any of the other Scottsboro defendants, but they are the historical antecedents of Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride, Jonathan Farrell, Ramerly Graham, Jordan Davis, Ernest Hoskins Jr., Tanisha Anderson, Rosehad McIntosh, Ora Rain Rosser, Darian Hunt, Michael Brown, Kajim Powell, Vonderett D. Myers Jr., John Crawford III, Eric Garner, Kerry Ball Jr., Akai Gurley, Tamir Rice. But let's be clear, it is not the body count that matters. It is the history of a vibrant, grassroots, radical movement that matters. It is resistance to injustice and an ongoing struggle to create a new world that matters. The young organizers in Ferguson and St. Louis, Missouri, from Hands Up United, Lost Voices, Organization for Black Struggle, Don't Shoot Coalition, and Millennial Activists United, are the bearers of the Alabama Communist Party's legacy. So are Florida's Dream Defenders. So are the young Chicago activists who founded We Charge Genocide and the Black Youth Project 100. So is the Moral Mondays movement, the multiracial coalition based in North Carolina and Georgia whose members returned to jail in the cause of racial, class, and gender justice. So are those visionary activists in post-Katrina New Orleans, a key battleground in neoliberalism's unrelenting war on working people, where black organizers lead multiracial coalitions to resist the privatization of schools, hospitals, public transit, public housing, and dismantling of public sector unions. So are the Los Angeles-based youth who make up the Community Rights Campaign, and the hundreds of organizations across the country challenging everyday state violence, occupation, exploitation, and wage theft. They remind us that the problems that beset us cannot be fixed with reforms or legislation or a better president. They understand that we are still grappling with the consequences of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and patriarchy. I did not propose a 25th anniversary edition of Hammer and Hoe simply to mark time, to sell books, or to frame how a new, invisible army might read and process this extraordinary story. I think the most important lessons are not necessarily the ones I recognize or acknowledge, but the lessons readers take from the book upon reflecting on their own experiences and dreams of the world they are trying to build. That said, I do think that the book proves, again, that anti-racism and class solidarity are not trade-offs or mutually exclusive but mutually constitutive. The same holds true for all forms of oppression, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, etc. Second, the communists placed what appeared to be local and isolated struggles against mean bosses and landlords in a global context, one that exposed the structural dimensions of racial capitalism as a system and offered a different path forward. Third, the movement did, in some ways, lay the groundwork for the next generation of activists who truly transformed the face of the South and the United States as a whole. Finally, this work reveals something about how people think and how struggle changes their ideas about what is possible, why they are poor and oppressed, and what alternatives to Jim Crow capitalism might look like. I've come to realize that this task might have been the most important of all. 1. It never occurred to me until now, but it is perhaps not a coincidence that one of my first published essays examined the transition to socialism in the People's Republic of the Congo. See Robin D. G. Kelley. Problems of Socialist Transformation in Africa, The Congolese Experience. Hammer 13, Numbers 2 and 3, 1984 259 to 282. 2. Robin D. G. Kelley. The Role of the International Sports Boycott in the Anti-Apartheid Movement. Hammer 13, Numbers 2 and 3, 1984 26 to 39. 3. Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Washington, D.C., Howard University Press, 1981, originally 1972, Chinweezu, The West and the Rest of Us, White Predators, Black Enslavers, and the African Elite, New York, Random House, 1975, Angela Davis, Women, Race and Class, New York, Random House, 1981, Vincent Harding, There is a River. The Black Struggle for Freedom in America, New York, Random House, 1983, Manning Marable, Blackwater, Historical Studies in Race, Class Consciousness and Revolution, Dayton, Ohio, Black Praxis Press, 1981, and How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, Boston, South End Press, 1982, Cornell West, Prophesied Deliverance, and Afro-American Revolutionary Christianity, Philadelphia, Westminster, 1982, Barbara Smith's many articles, some of which were later collected in The Truth That Never Hurts, Writings on Race, Gender and Freedom, Piscataway, New Jersey, Rutgers University Press, 1998, and the Essential Edited Collections. Barbara Smith, Gloria T. Hull, and Patricia Bell Scott, eds, All the Women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave, Black Women's Studies, New York, The Feminist Press, 1982, Barbara Smith, edition, Homegirls, A Black Feminist Anthology, New York, Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, 1983, Edward Said, Orientalism, New York, Pantheon, 1978, and The Question of Palestine, New York, Vintage, 1980. Among Samir Amin's many books, most influential at the time was Unequal Development, an essay on the social formations of peripheral capitalism, New York. Monthly Review Press, 1976. 4. Cedric J. Robinson, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2000, originally 1983. 5. Robin D. G. Kelley. The Third International and the Struggle for National Liberation in South Africa, 1921 to 1928. Hammer 15, Numbers 2 and 3, 1986-99 to 120. 6. Robin D. G. Kelley, Unpublished Journal, December 1986, in author's possession. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. 7. Lemon Johnson, Interview with Author, December 20, 1986. 8. Theodore Rosengarten, All God's Dangers, The Life of Nate Shaw, New York, Knopf, 1974. Nell Irvin Painter, The Narrative of Hosea Hudson, His Life as a Negro Communist in the South, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1979. Portions of these works were published in Radical America, Nell Painter and Hosea Hudson. Hosea Hudson, A Negro Communist in the Deep South. Radical America 11, July-August 1977 7-23. Theodore Rosengarten and Dale Rosen. Shootout at Reeltown, The Narrative of Jess Hull, Alabama Tenant Farmer. Radical America 6, November-December 1972 65-84. See also Theodore Rosengarten. Reminiscences of Theodore Rosengarten. Lecture, Oral History Project, Columbia University, New York, 1976. Also, Hosea Hudson produced his own book, Black Worker in the Deep South, New York, International Publishers, 1972. 9. Shinobu Yusuji, Kaminkan Undu Hino Michi, America Nanbu no Sun Yakura Kokujin no Tatakai, The Way to the Civil Rights Movement, The Struggle of African Americans in the American South, Tokyo, Iwanami Shoten, 1998. 10. George Roick, The Historical Roots of Black Liberation. Radical America 2, July-August 1968 1-13. Working Class Self-Activity. Radical America 3, March-April 1969 23-31. Notes on the American Working Class. Speak Out, June-July 1968. These and other essays have been reprinted in an excellent anthology of Roick's writings. David Roediger, ed., Listening to Revolt, The Selected Writings of George Roick, Chicago, Charles H. Kerr Publishers, 2010. 11. George Lipsitz, Class and Culture in Cold War America. A Rainbow at Midnight. New York, Praeger, 1981. A revised and expanded version of the book was published 13 years later as A Rainbow at Midnight, Labor and Culture in the 1940s, Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 1994. 12. George Lipsitz, A Life in the Struggle, Ivory Perry and the Culture of Opposition, Philadelphia, Temple University Press, 1988.12. 13. Notable examples include Minka Makalani, In the Cause of Freedom, Radical Black Internationalism from Harlem to London, 1917-1939, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2011, Deo F. Gore, Radicalism at the Crossroads, African American Women Activists in the Cold War, New York University Press, 2011. Eric S. McDuffie, Sojourning for Freedom, Black Women, American Communism, and the Making of Black Left Feminism, Durham, North Carolina, Duke University Press, 2011. Cheryl Higashida, Black Internationalist Feminism, Women Writers of the Black Left, 1945-1995, Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 2011. William J. Maxwell, New Negro. Old Left, African American Writing and Communism Between the Wars, New York, Columbia University Press, 1999. Mark Solomon, The Cry Was Unity, Communists and African Americans. 1917-1936, Jackson, University Press of Mississippi, 1998. T. Michael Holmes, The Specter of Communism in Hawaii, Honolulu, University of Hawaii Press, 1994. Winston James, Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, Caribbean Radicalism in Early 20th Century America, London, Verso, 1998. Kate Weigand, Red Feminism. American Communism and the Making of Women's Liberation, Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2000. Robert Kors Tad, Civil Rights Unionism. Tobacco Workers and the Struggle for Democracy in the Mid-20th Century South, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2003. Jonathan Holloway, Confronting the Veil, Abram Harris Jr., E. Franklin Frazier, and Ralph Bunch, 1919-1941, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2002. Carol Boyce Davies, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, Durham, North Carolina. Duke University Press, 2008. Susan D. Pennybacker, From Scottsboro to Munich, Race and Political Culture in 1930s Britain, Princeton University Press, 2009. Eric S. Gelman, Death Blow to Jim Crow, The National Negro Congress and the Rise of Militant Civil Rights, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2012. Michael C. Dawson, Blacks in and Out of the Left, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 2013. Brian Dulliner, The Black Cultural Front. Black Writers and Artists of the Depression Generation, Jackson, University Press of Mississippi, 2012. Mary Helen Washington, The Other Blacklist, The African American Literary and Cultural Left of the 1950s, New York, Columbia University Press 2014, Michael Honey, Southern Labor and Black Civil Rights, Organizing Memphis Workers, Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 1993. Bill Mullen, Popular Fronts, Chicago and African American Cultural Politics, 1935-46, Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 1999. William J. Billingsley, Communists on Campus, Race, Politics, and the Public University in 60s North Carolina, Athens, University of Georgia Press, 1999. Gregory S. Taylor. The History of the North Carolina Communist Party, Columbia, University of South Carolina Press, 2009. Richard Eiton, Solidarity Blues, Race, Culture, and the American Left, Chapel Hill. University of North Carolina Press, 2000. Karen Ferguson, Black Politics and New Deal Atlanta, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2002. Vernon L. Peterson, The Communist Party in Maryland, 191957, Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 2000. Walter Howard, We Shall Be Free, Black Communist Protests in Seven Voices, Philadelphia. Temple University Press, 2013. Josephine Fowler, Japanese and Chinese Immigrant Activists, Organizing in American and International Communist Movements, 1919-1933, New Brunswick, New Jersey, Rutgers University Press. 2007, Howard Eugene Johnson, with Mark D. Nazone, A Dancer in the Revolution, Stretch Johnson, Harlem Communist at the Cotton Club, New York, Fordham University Press, 2014, and numerous work by Gerald Horne, most recently, Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii, Honolulu, University of Hawaii Press. 2011, and Black Revolutionary, William Patterson and the Globalization of the African American Freedom Struggle, Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 2013. Jeff Woods, Black Struggle, Red Scare, Segregation and Anti-Communism in the South, 1948-1968, Baton Rouge, Louisiana University Press, 2003, and several works by Alan Wald, most recently Exiles from a Future Time, The Forging of the Mid-20th Century Literary Left, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2002. An American Night, The Literary Left in the Era of the Cold War, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2012. 14. Randy Storch. Moscow's Archives and the New History of the Communist Party of the United States. Perspectives on History, October 2000, http://www.historians.org/publications and directories/perspectives in history /October 2000 Moscow's Archives and the New History of the Communist Party of the United States. Access December 14, 2014. 15. Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore, Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, 1919-1950, New York, W. Norton, 2008. 16. Randy Storch, Red Chicago, American Communism at its Grassroots, 1928-35, Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 2008. 17. See Natalie Byfield, Savage Portrayals, Race, Media, and the Central Park Jogger Story, Philadelphia, Temple University Press, 2014. Ain't no foreign country in the world foreign as Alabama to a New Yorker. They know all about England, maybe France, never met one who knew. Bama. Anonymous Black Communist, 1945. After spending several years hobnobbing with European, Asian, and Soviet dignitaries of the Third International, daily worker correspondent Joseph North made a most unforgettable journey to, of all places, Chambers County, Alabama. Traveling surreptitiously with a black Birmingham communist as his escort, North reached his destination, the tumble-down shack of a sharecropper comrade, in the wee hours of the night. The dark figure who greeted the two men had read The Worker for years, solid and reliable. He was respected by his folk here, who regarded him as a man with answers. The sharecropper was an elder in the Zion A.M.E. Church, who trusts God but keeps his powder dry, reads his Bible every night, can quote from the Book of Daniel and the Book of Job, and he's been 1. Studying the Stalin book on the nation question. Although North's visit took place in 1945, on the eve of the Alabama Party's collapse, the sharecropper comrade he describes above epitomized the complex, seemingly contradictory radical legacy the party left behind. Built from scratch by working people without a Euro-American left-wing tradition, the Alabama Communist Party was enveloped by the cultures and ideas of its constituency. Composed largely of poor blacks, most of whom were semi-literate and devoutly religious, the Alabama cadre also drew a small circle of white folks, whose ranks swelled or diminished over time, ranging from ex-Klansmen to former Wobblies, unemployed male industrial workers to iconoclastic youth, restless housewives to renegade liberals. These unlikely radicals, their milieu, and the movement they created make up the central subjects of this book. Heeding Victoria de Grazia's appeal to historians of the American left for a social history of politics, I have tried to construct a narrative that examines communist political opposition through the lenses of social and cultural history, paying particular attention to the worlds from which these radicals came, the worlds in which they lived, and the imaginary worlds they sought to build. I pluralize worlds to emphasize the myriad individual and collective differences within the Alabama communist movement. Those assembled under the red banner did not all share the same vision of radical opposition, nor were they motivated by the same circumstances. Neither the Jimmy or Jane Higginses of historian Aileen Cratter's mind nor the dowdy, selfless caricatures of left-wing fiction, these women and men came from the farms, factories, mines, kitchens, and city streets, not as intellectual blank sheets but loaded down with cultural and ideological baggage molded by their race, class, gender, work, community, region, history, upbringing, and collective memory. Their ideas and concerns shaped the party's political practice and social life at the most local level. And in turn, Alabama radicals were themselves shaped by local CP leaders' efforts to change the way ordinary people thought about politics, history, and society. What emerged was a malleable movement rooted in a variety of different pasts, reflecting a variety of different voices, and incorporating countless contradictory tendencies. The movement's very existence validates literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin's observation that a culture is not static but open, capable of death and renewal, transcending itself, that is, exceeding its own. 2. And Alabama communists had titanic boundaries to exceed. More than in the Northeast and Midwest, the regional incubators of American communism, race pervaded virtually every aspect of Southern society. The relations between industrial labor and capital, and landlords and tenants, were clouded by divisions based on skin color. On the surface, at least, it seemed that there existed two separate racial communities in the segregated South that only intersected in the world of work, or at the marketplace. Sharp class distinctions endured within both black and white communities, but racism tended to veil, and at times arrest, interracial class conflict as well as interracial working class unity. Alabama party leaders could not escape the prevalence of race, despite their unambiguous emphasis on class-based politics. Indeed, during its first 5 years in Alabama, the CP inevitably evolved into a race organization, a working-class alternative to the NAACP. As Nell Painter observed, the rank-and-file folk made the party their own. In Alabama in the 1930s, the CP was a Southern, working-class black organization. 3. The homegrown radicalism that had germinated in poor black communities and among tiny circles of white rebels remained deep underground. Alabama communists did not have much choice. Their challenge to racism and to the status quo prompted a wave of repression one might think inconceivable in a democratic country. The extent and character of anti-radical repression in the South constitute a crucial part of our story. When we ponder Werner Sombart's question, "Why is there no socialism in the United States?" in light of the South, violence and lawlessness loom large. The fact is, the CP and its auxiliaries in Alabama did have a considerable following, some of whom devoured Marxist literature and dreamed of a socialist world. But to be a communist, an ILD member, or an SCU militant was to face the possibility of imprisonment, beatings, kidnapping, and even death. And yet the party survived, and at times thrived, in this thoroughly racist, racially divided, and repressive social world. Indeed, most scholars have underestimated the Southern left and have underrated the role violence played in quashing radical movements. Religious fundamentalism, white racism, black ignorance or indifference, the communists' presumed insensitivity to Southern culture, their advocacy of black self-determination during the early 1930s, and an overall lack of class consciousness are all oft-cited explanations for the party's failure. 4. The experiences of Alabama communists, however, suggest that racial divisions were far more fluid and Southern working-class consciousness far more complex than most historians have realized. The African Americans who made up the Alabama radical movement experienced and opposed race and class oppression as a totality. The party and its various auxiliaries served as vehicles for black working-class opposition on a variety of different levels ranging from anti-racist activities to interracial class conflict. Furthermore, the CP attracted some openly bigoted whites despite its militant anti-racist slogans. The party also drew women whose efforts to overcome gender-defined limitations proved more decisive to their radicalization than did either race or class issues. I suppose I should say something about the now infamous debate over the PUS's relationship to the Communist International. Although it had been brewing since the New Social Historians who sought to rewrite CP history from the bottom up, challenged earlier studies by Theodore Draper and others depicting American communists as veritable puppets of Kremlin intrigue. The controversy reached a climax in 1985 when battle lines were drawn between pro- and anti-Draper forces and a deluge of 5. As a 23-year-old graduate student about to embark on what would have been a multi-volume dissertation on the Communist Party in South Africa and the American South, I was eager to enter the fray. But as I was an unknown entity in the academic community with only a book review to my credit, no respectable journal or newspaper would have taken me seriously. Nevertheless, my youth and anonymity turned out to be a blessing in disguise, for after having spent the next 4 years living and breathing Alabama CP history, the whole debate seems, in retrospect, rather superfluous, even silly. Of course, the Alabama cadre dutifully followed national and international leadership, just as Birmingham NAACP leaders jumped at every directive handed down from their executive secretary Walter White. Local communists cried out for direction, especially after wrestling with vague theoretical treatises on capital's crisis or on the growing specter of fascism. Though they knowingly bucked national leadership decisions on a few occasions, local cadre tried their best to apply the then current political line to the tasks at hand. But because neither Joe Stalin, Earl Browder, nor William Z. Foster spoke directly to them or to their daily problems, Alabama communists developed strategies and tactics in response to local circumstances that, in most cases, had nothing to do with international crises. Besides, if Alabamians had waited patiently for orders from Moscow, they might still be waiting today. Not only were lines of communication between New York and Birmingham hazy throughout the 1930s and 1940s, but Birmingham communists had enough difficulty maintaining contact with comrades as close as Tallapoosa County. The complex and decentralized structure of party organization in Alabama requires a nuanced, somewhat detailed narrative sensitive to local history. Hammer and Hoe examines party activity in the neighborhoods, industrial suburbs, company towns of the greater Birmingham-Bessemer area, the Black Belt and its urban centers of Montgomery and Selma, and the eastern Piedmont counties. When possible, I have tried to chronicle CP work in Mobile as well as in several northern Alabama counties, but communists there did not have much of a public presence and left very few records. The organization of this book, therefore, reflects the party's multi-issue, multi-community focus. Following a brief portrait of Birmingham from its inception to the Great Depression, Part 1 reconstructs the period from 1930 to 1935 in 5 thematic chapters. Chapter 1 documents the party's origins and early organizing efforts among Birmingham's jobless from 1930 to 1933. Turning to the countryside, Chapter 2 chronicles the Sharecroppers Union's first 5 years and offers some insights into the context and character of rural radicalism. The party's industrial organizing efforts and the intensification of anti-radical repression during the 1934 strike wave are the focus of Chapter 3. The 4th chapter looks at the CP-led International Labor Defense's challenge to black middle-class leadership and examines the racial, class, and sexual dimensions of the ILD's involvement in alleged rape cases. The final chapter in Part 1 steps back from the narrative for a moment and explores the social, ideological, and cultural foundations of radicalism among black communists, the ways in which Marxist pedagogy influenced their outlook, and the party's role in shaping class conflict within the black community. Part 2, which deals with the Popular Front, 1935 to 39, adopts a similar thematic format. Chapter 6, 1935-37, traces local leaders' response to and interpretation of the new policy, discusses communist efforts to build alliances with Southern liberals, and examines the effect of Popular Front politics on the party's rank and file. Chapters 7 through 9 analyze the communists' role in building both the Congress of Industrial Organizations and the Workers' Alliance, and document the collapse of the Sharecroppers Union. These 3 chapters, along with Chapter 6, explain the decline in black party membership during the Popular Front, the Birmingham CP's retreat from working-class militancy and entrance into the world of Southern liberalism, the period from 1937 to 1939, are the subjects of Chapter 10. Part 3, which covers the historical moment from the Nazi-Soviet pact to U.S. entry into World War II, consists of a single chapter. Here we find the party on the road to revitalization, not as an autonomous organization but as part of a much broader, radical interracial youth movement. Finally, the epilogue sweeps through the war and post-war periods, reconstructing the party's ultimate demise and ruminating on the legacy it left behind. In closing, I should add that some of the stories herein have been told before. 2 decades ago, an old black farmer named Ned Cobb shared his recollections of the communist-led Sharecroppers Union with Theodore and Dale Rosengarten. The result was the moving narrative All God's Dangers, 1974. Another participant, Griot, Hosea Hudson, preserved the struggles of Birmingham communists in his heavily edited book, Black Worker in the Deep South, 1972. A few years later, The richness and complexity of Hudson's life and the lives of his comrades were brilliantly captured by Nell Irvin Painter in the narrative of Hosea Hudson, His Life as a Negro Communist in the South, 1979. Two magnificent oral memoirs are a hell of an act to follow. No university-trained historian can match the beauty and grace of Cobb's and Hudson's storytelling, nor can she or he convey, with all the required subtleties, the feelings, the fears, the pride, the confusion, the mosaic of emotions that went with being black and radical in the Depression South. In order to truly appreciate the men and women who made the movement, I urge all to read Rosengarten's and Painter's wonderful narratives as companion volumes to this book. The saga of the Alabama Communist Party is but a chapter in a larger work waiting to be written. Communists were all over the South, from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to Oxford, Mississippi, influencing communities and individuals in ways we have yet to understand, making history we have yet to know. Though they never seized state power or led a successful socialist revolution below the Mason-Dixon line, communists deserve a place in Southern history. As former Alabama Party leader Robert Fowler Hall argued a few years ago, if the courage of white liberals, though ineffective, is worth a book, the courage of Southern communists during 6. At the very least, some. Atlanta and Chapel Hill, July 1989. The personal debts I've incurred while working on this book have made me more sensitive to the plight of gamblers and third world nations. I am especially grateful to those who fed and housed me during various stages of research and writing. Major funding was provided by the Institute of American Cultures, Center for Afro-American Studies, UCLA, the Dorothy Danforth Compton Fellowship, the UCLA Graduate Affirmative Affairs Office, and the Carolina Minority Postdoctoral Fellowship, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. For such generous financial support I owe a great deal to Claudia Mitchell-Kernan, Belinda Tucker, Cheryl Armstrong-Turner, and Edward Alpers. My tenure with the UCLA Oral History Project, under the kind and sensitive direction of Dale Treleaven, not only provided crucial financial assistance but proved an excellent training ground. Family, friends, and folks I hardly knew at first gave more than any grant or fellowship could ever give. The many people who opened their homes, hearts, and or purses include my sister and brother-in-law, Makani Themba Parrish and Van Parrish, my mother, Ananda Sadwa, my younger siblings, Mylan Carter, Chris Kelly, and Idrissa Morehouse, my grandmother, Jima Carmen Chambers, my mother-in-law Annette Rohan, my father and his wife, Donald Kelly and Mary Kay, my cousin Arlene Liddy, Professors Robert and Melbourne Cummings, Kamala Anderson, Regina Woodland, Tony Cook, Eugene Mackey, Kathleen Mackey, Sean Backus, Barbara Saunders, Old Man, Joe Moton, Stephanie Webb and her wonderful family, Abigail Van Alstyne, and Redding Pitt. Without these folks I'd still be in graduate school, posturing and crying broke. Those communists, ex-communists, and miscellaneous observers who took time out to discuss their experiences warrant more than an acknowledgement. They deserve downright praise. I shall be forever grateful to Hosea Hudson and Lemon Johnson, both of whom passed away before this book was completed, Charles Smith, James E. Jackson, Esther Cooper Jackson, Marge France, Lauren France, Alice Burke Jarvis, H. D. Koch, Clyde and N. Johnson, Rob Hall and his family, Gil Green, the late H. L. Mitchell, and Braden, Ned Harrison, Junius Scales, and Don Wheeldon. Marge France, James and Esther Jackson, and Clyde Johnson read all or part of the manuscript and offered critical suggestions and corrections. Marge and Lauren shared precious FOIPA FBI documents pertaining to their activities in Alabama, as well as those of Joseph Gelders. The late James S. Allen, Josh Dunson, and Millicent Selsom were gracious enough to provide me with a copy of Allen's unpublished manuscript and permitted me to quote from it. Scholars who claim collegiality has died know little of the world I entered when I began this project. Even when I was a graduate student merely testing the muddy waters of communist historiography, a number of eminent historians freely offered time, information, and encouragement, a rare thing, especially for black graduate students who must enter the academy through long, dark pipelines or sneak in through windows of opportunity. Nell Irvin Painter and Mark Nazone, both of whom saw this book grow from an inchoate idea to an unwieldy dissertation to a publishable manuscript, carefully and patiently read several drafts of the work at various stages. Their selfless assistance, scholarship, and enthusiasm for this project can never be paid back in full. The same must be said of Elsa Barkley Brown, Paul and Mary Jo Bull, Leon Fink, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, Lois Rita Helmbold, Michael Honey, Tara Hunter, Walter Jackson, Robert Korstad, Cliff Kuhn, Susan Levine, Jeff Norrell, Linda Reed, Julius Scott, and Stephanie Shaw. Jacqueline and Elsa, each in her own special way, schooled me in feminist theory and helped me understand the meaning of multiple consciousness. I have Paul to thank for punctuating my writing blues with long, wonderful, witty missives, for introducing me to some Russian dude named Mikhail Bakhtin, and for reintroducing me to C. L. R. James. Other scholars who read all or parts of the manuscript or offered helpful suggestions for further inquiry include John Laslett, Edward Alpers, Cedric Robinson, Stuart Clark, Robert Hill, Gerald Gill, Sidney J. Lamel, Tricia Rose, Dolores Januski, Gerald Zahavi, George Roick, Jonathan Prude, Dan T. Carter, Shinobu Yasuji, Charles Martin, Harvey Clare, August Meyer, Mark Solomon, Jim Filiu, Dale and Theodore Rosengarten, and Gerald Home. Theodore Draper graciously gave me permission to use his rich collection of Communist Party materials at Emory University and the Hoover Institution. I owe special thanks to my colleagues at Emory University for their unflinching support, most notably Mary Odom, Russell Andalcio, Margot Finn, and Dwight Andrews, all of whom remained in my corner at critical moments, and to Dean David Minter for allowing me to take my first year off in order to finish Hammer and Hoe. My editor, Louis Bateman, has been a fountain of encouragement as well as a sensitive reader and relentless critic. I am equally grateful to Iris Tillman Hill for introducing me to the UNC Press family. Finally, I must thank Carl Gardner for the index, not to mention the tasty honey from his farm, and Deborah Beckel for putting me in touch with Carl. Without exception, I was always warmly received and assisted by archivists across the country. Particularly memorable were the courtesies extended to me by Marvin Y. Whiting, Director of Special Collections, Birmingham Public Library, Dan Williams and Linda Harvey of the Hollis Burke Frissell Library, Special Collections, Tuskegee Institute, Ed Bridges, Director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History, Minnie Harris Clayton, Director of the Division of Archives and Special Collections, Woodruff Library, Atlanta University, Ronald Becker, Curator of Manuscripts, Rutgers University, Joyce Lamont, Director of W.S. Hoole Special Collections, University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Esme Bond, Manuscript Division of the Moreland Springer Research Center, Howard University, Eleanor Sinnett, Oral History Librarian, Moreland Springer Research Center, Howard University, Ethel Lobman and Mary Allison Farley, Tamiment Institute, Bob's Library, New York University, and Sarah Cooper, Director of the Southern California Library for Social Studies and Research. I have reserved this last paragraph for my best friend and comrade, Deidre Harris Kelley. Typical spousal cliches are inappropriate for describing her role in the production of this book. She certainly did not make the research and writing any easier, nor did she allow Hammer and Hoe to interfere with my domestic duties. But she did break the monotony of an historian's life by turning each day into an adventure. She endured constant intrusions with remarkable patience, read drafts of the work, uprooted inconsistencies, analyzed my dreams, bragged to our families about how our book is coming along, and survived my famous vegetarian neckbone soup when photocopying costs drained our finances. Being the enthusiast she is, behind closed doors she cussed out every single individual who dared criticize me or my work, and yet she remained a relentless critic in her own right. Deidre's most important contribution to Hammer and Hoe graces the dust jacket. A great artist by trade and spirit, her powerful portrait of Alabama communists captures the essence of Southern radicalism in ways that mere words could never convey. The following abbreviations and acronyms are used in the text. For abbreviations used in the notes, see pages 233 to 34. AAA. Agricultural Adjustment Act. AFL. American Federation of Labor AFU. Alabama Farmers Union ANLC. American Negro Labor Congress APA. Alabama People's Education Association ASFL. Alabama State Federation of Labor AWDC. Alabama Women's Democratic Club. CCC. Civilian Conservation Corps CFWU. Croppers and Farm Workers Union. CIC. CIO. Commission on Interracial Cooperation. Congress of Industrial Organizations CP, PUSA. Communist Party of the United States of America CWA. Civil Works Administration. CYS. Council of Young Southerners. ERP. Employee Representation Plan ERWO. Etowah Rubber Workers Organization. FBI. Federal Bureau of Investigation FEPC. Fair Employment Practices Committee FERA. Federal Emergency Relief Act FLCFWU. Farm Laborers and Cotton Field Workers Union. FSA. Farm Security Administration WAC. House Un-American Activities Committee. ILA. ILD. ISU. International Longshoremen's Association. International Labor Defense. International Seamen's Union IWW. Industrial Workers of the World KKK. Ku Klux Klan LSNR. League of Struggle for Negro Rights. LYS. League of Young Southerners Mine Mill. International Union of Mine, Mill and Smelter Workers NAACP. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People NCDPP. National Committee for the Defense of Political Prisoners NCPR. National Committee for People's Rights NEC. National Emergency Council NFU. National Farmers Union NERA. National Industrial Recovery Act NLRB. National Labor Relations Board NMU. National Miners Union NNC. National Negro Congress NRA. National Recovery Administration NSL. RPC. National Students League. Revolutionary Policy Committee RWL. Relief Workers League Charles Schwab. Southern Conference for Human Welfare SCPR. Southern Committee for People's Rights SCU. Sharecroppers Union SNCC. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee SNYC Youth Congress. Southern Negro Youth Congress SP SBA. Socialist Party of America SPC. Southern Policy Committee SDFU. Southern Tenant Farmers Union SWOC. Steel Workers Organizing Committee TCI. Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company TUL. Trade Union Unity League UCOPOA. United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America UMW. United Mine Workers of Alabama UMWA. United Mine Workers of America UNIA. Universal Negro Improvement Association URWA. United Rubber Workers of America WPA. Works Progress Administration YCL. Young Communist League. Hammer and Hoe. It is an industrial monster sprung up in the midst of a slow-moving pastoral. It does not belong, and yet it is one of the many proofs that Alabama is an amazing country, heterogeneous, grotesque, full of incredible contrasts. Birmingham is a new city in an old land. Carl Carmer. Perhaps more than any other city, Birmingham comes closest to embodying the mythic New South creed. Its resident and absentee mine and mill owners turned a cornfield and a swamp into a multiracial, bustling, smoky bastion of industrial capitalism where profits ruled and the feudal values of the Old South echoed faintly in the background. Their wealth depended on a huge, disciplined, docile labor force, but unlike machines, working people and their advocates fought to alter conditions they considered unjust or intolerable. Thus, as a competing center of heavy industry, Birmingham was to the deep south what Cripple Creek, Colorado, or Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, was to the west, a cauldron of class conflict. But as Carl Carmer so eloquently explains above, the matrix of old and new makes Birmingham an unparalleled industrial center. The mine and mill owners hoped to mold an industrial proletariat in a city founded less than a generation after the abolition of chattel slavery and peopled with two races afraid of each 1. Other. From the discovery and exploitation of large mineral deposits in central Alabama emerged the Birmingham Industrial Complex, a region often called the Pittsburgh of the South. Before 1879, the Pratt Coal and Coke Company mined and exported the rich deposits of iron ore, coal, and limestone to northern industries. When TCI took over the holdings of the Pratt Coal and Coke Company in 1886, which 5 years earlier had been purchased by industrialist Enoch Ensley, TCI became the most prodigious iron and steel manufacturer in the South. TCI swallowed up a large portion of the local iron and steel industry, and most remaining holdouts merged into 3 competing companies, the Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron 2. Company, the Woodward Iron Company, and the Republic Iron and Steel Company. The juxtaposition of limestone, coking coal, dolomite, and red hematite or substantially reduced production costs, but it was not enough to make Birmingham's coal and iron industry competitive on the national market. Unlike the alluvial or found in the Great Lakes region, Birmingham's deposits were buried deep below mountainous slopes, and the region's insufficient water supply, increased transportation costs, and the lower metallic content of its rendered capital investments comparatively higher. Yet, cheap black and white labor from the Alabama countryside compensated for the capital-intensive nature of mining, making the 3. Although Birmingham's profits rarely measured up to expectations and fortunes were earned and lost in an economy that resembled a slot machine, the district nevertheless generated tremendous wealth for a tiny minority. In 1910, individuals whose net worth was over $35,000 comprised merely 1% of the population, whereas 80% earned below $500 per annum. In addition to having the means for an elegant lifestyle, this small group of industrialists wielded enormous economic and political power. Interlocking directorships and control over various real estate, banking, and mining ventures were held by such individuals as Henry T. de Bartleben, Robert I. Ingalls, Erskine Ramsay, Robert Jemison, Jr., Walter Henley, and others. Although few held political office, these men used financial strength to exercise considerable power over local government. Birmingham's nouveau riche industrialists spent lavishly and developed a strong consciousness of class and a sense of social cohesion. They built plush mansions in areas such as Shades Valley and Mountain Brooks estates, distant from the bellowing smoke of the steel mills. In a spectacular display of wealth, one Birmingham capitalist built a home replicating a Roman temple. Alongside numerous bronze and plaster statues sat 2 dog houses built like miniature Parthenons, with classic porticos and tiny 4. Below in the Valley of the Furnaces was another world in the making. Thousands of landless farmers from the surrounding counties, particularly blacks, were rapidly drawn into the orbit of industrial production. By 1900, 55% of Alabama's coal miners and 65% of its iron and steel workers were black. Overall, African Americans made up more than 90% of Birmingham's unskilled labor force by 1910, thus constituting one of the largest black urban communities in the New South. As in any other New South urban community, race penetrated all aspects of the city's life. Segregation ordinances proliferated between 1900 and 1905, and Alabama's move to disfranchise blacks reduced the state's black voters from 5. Segregation in the public sphere reinforced the development of a separate black social and cultural world. Yet unlike northern urban centers such as New York or Chicago, where blacks were concentrated in 1 or 2 dense sections of the city, Birmingham's blacks resided in several segregated pockets situated along creeks, railroad lines, and alleys near the downtown area. Black working-class neighborhoods throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century suffered from lack of streetlights, paved streets, sewers, and other city services. Birmingham was an unmistakably segregated city, but spatially there was no single, identifiable black community to speak of. Excluding the greater Birmingham area and the surrounding industrial suburbs, the central core of black residents settled along the 20th Street axis from the southern section of the city toward the railroad tracks. 6. Not all blacks toiled in the mines, mills, kitchens, and streets of Birmingham. A tiny but influential black elite established a flourishing business district along 18th Street in the heart of downtown. As early as 1890, the Reverend W. R. Pettiford founded and presided over Birmingham's first black bank, the Alabama Penny Savings and Loan. And black residents often boasted of their millionaire inventor, Andrew J. Beard, or the affluent funeral director and insurance magnate C. M. Harris. Black businessmen and religious leaders made their fortunes from a consumer base of working-class blacks, ensured peaceful relations by creating alliances with white industrialists, and a handful secured enough respectability to retain the franchise. Like the white elite, they maintained their own exclusive social clubs and rarely interacted with poor blacks. While the Negro Federation of Women's Clubs and allied organizations occasionally focused on social welfare issues, black Birmingham's numerous religious and literary societies occupied a great deal of the black. 7. The black elite could not always find complete satisfaction in material wealth when they, too, were denied basic democratic rights. Some black middle-class spokesmen searched for autonomous alternatives to Jim Crow within and without the region. African colonization and other immigration schemes were proposed by blacks and white liberals during the late 19th century, and in Oxford, Alabama, in 1899, a group of leading black citizens established one of the nation's first all-black towns. In virtually every case of black political assertion, however, the white status quo only recognized as spokespersons for the African American community the black elite, whether followers of the accommodationist teachings of Booker T. Washington or the Back to Africa movement of Bishop Henry McNeill Turner. And rarely was the black elite's self. 8. The newly created industrial complex also attracted significant numbers of immigrants from northern mining communities or directly from Europe. By 1890, first and second generation immigrants, particularly Italians, Scots, Germans, and Britons, comprised nearly 1/4 of Birmingham's white population, a substantial number for the urban South. More striking is the fact that in 1910 1/2 of the coal, iron, and steel workers were immigrants, many of whom had been skilled colliers and metal workers before moving south. As southern whites left the farm to take advantage of Birmingham's employment opportunities, the percentage of immigrants in the labor force declined precipitously. Although thousands of white migrants found their way into the cotton mills and lumber yards in other parts of the state, a large portion joined black workers and immigrants in the 9. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, thousands of southern women also left the farm and found work in the greater Birmingham area or simply labored as unpaid workers in the households of their husbands who toiled in the mines and mills. The proletarianization of white females drawn to the state's rapidly growing textile industry hardly affected Birmingham. Textile factories there employed only 283 women in 1930. The city's 8,038 white working women were scattered in dozens of occupations, mainly clerical and professional pursuits. Although limited wartime industrialization led to an increase in white female wage labor, by 1930 most white women worked as housewives. In fact, despite numerical increases, the percentage of women wage earners in the state decreased from 40.9% in 1910 to 25.5% in 1930. And this figure mainly indicates the status of white women, of whom 85% were reportedly housewives in 1930. In 1920, black women comprised 60% of the city's 20,082 female workers, and of that number 87% were engaged. 10. The thousands of women and men who streamed into Birmingham searching for opportunities made up the cheap labor force from which local capitalists could make their fortunes. Yet the city's young proletariat was by no means docile. On the contrary, many had had some organizing experience. 2 decades prior to the populist upheaval of the 1890s, James T. Rapier, black leader of the Labor Union of Alabama, an affiliate of the newly formed National Labor Union, attempted to organize black industrial and agricultural workers throughout the state. More significantly, the Knights of Labor and the Greenback Labor Party established a tradition of militant, interracial unionism among Birmingham coal miners. Blacks comprised the majority of Greenback Labor supporters in the Birmingham district before the party dissolved in 1880. Working among black and white coal miners and lumber workers throughout Alabama, the Knights proved quite effective, establishing a number of local assemblies in Jefferson County. While Knights led several small strikes in Alabama's coal fields between 1882 and 1885, the organization on a national level began to decline after 1886, partly because of anti-labor hysteria following the Haymarket Affair, the emergence of the AFL, and the leadership's decision. 11. 12. The UMW, a local movement distinct from the UMWA, founded by ex-Knights and rural migrants who brought agrarian radicalism to the mines and mills, continued organizing Birmingham workers until it was crushed during the coal miners' strike of 1894. Late in the decade, however, national leadership in the UMWA reinvigorated organized labor in Alabama's coal mines and began a campaign to rebuild the Union. All 3 organizations left a remarkable record of labor activity. Of 603 strikes initiated by Alabama's workers between 1881 and 1936, 303 took place during 188-11905. But as the 20th century approached, white workers began to drift away from the UMWA. During both the 1904 and 1908 coal miners' strikes, black workers were in the majority, taking advantage of the large black 13. presence in the UMWA. Employers adeptly used racist propaganda, violence, and black convict labor to weaken unionism in Alabama's coal fields. In the aftermath of the 1908 strike, TCI executive George Gordon Crawford adopted the paternalistic methods of the parent company, United States Steel, as a bulwark against unionism and to create a more stable labor force. Because of poor working conditions, dilapidated housing, overburdened public facilities, and polluted water supplies, the turnover rate for Birmingham labor hovered around 400%. Crawford sought to turn the situation around by establishing workers' villages with decent, well-constructed homes, playgrounds, schools, churches, and health facilities for employees. These segregated company-owned settlements were laid out in Greater Birmingham's industrial suburbs, especially North Birmingham, Woodlawn, Ensley, Greenwood, Collegeville, Smithfield, and Fairfield. The city of Bessemer established a similar residential pattern in which miners and some steel workers lived in company-owned double-tenant, shotgun houses. By 1920, over 17,000 workers lived in homes maintained by various industrial concerns and ranging in quality from well-constructed wood frame houses to shoddy dwellings of board and batten construction. Although conditions improved in many company communities and the turnover rate dropped significantly to 5.1% in 1930, TCI exercised greater control over workers' lives. 14. The UMWA in Alabama was temporarily crushed after World War I, more the result of state violence and race baiting than TCI's paternalistic policies. Disaster followed when Birmingham coal miners, 3/4 of whom were black, struck for higher wages in 1919 and again in 1920. Backed by state troops dispatched by Governor Thomas Kilby, TCI crushed the strike as well as the UMWA in Alabama. The union's collapse marked the end of biracial unionism in Alabama until the 1930s. 15. Iron ore miners and iron and steel workers did not establish the same tradition of interracial unionism during this period. The Metal Trades Council of Birmingham concentrated its efforts exclusively on skilled workers, ignoring black workers who comprised nearly one-half of the steel and iron workers and 70% of the ore miners. Given the unwritten racial quota on occupational mobility and the slowness of technological change in the iron and steel industry, black workers remained unskilled and, therefore, unorganized. In the iron ore mines, mass industrial organizing efforts were not only met with force and violence, but company officials used racist propaganda to keep black and white workers divided. Attempted strikes in 1918 and 1919 left the nascent industrial organizing campaign in shambles, and hundreds of dedicated Union men, black and white, were 16. Black convict laborers, Banner Mine, Alabama, courtesy Birmingham Public Library. The swelling ranks of women workers remained largely unorganized, and middle-class women's reform movements barely took notice of female toilers, particularly black women. Black domestic laborers, the majority of the female workforce, were considered unorganizable and unimportant, and thus were virtually invisible in the eyes of white male labor organizers. White middle-class women initiated a vibrant reform movement around women's suffrage, the YWCA movement, child labor reform, and opposition to convict labor. But middle-class reformers excluded poor white women and often, especially in the case of women's suffrage, exhibited hostilities toward their darker sisters. In the end, a dynamic women's interracial movement did not spring up in Birmingham as it had in areas such as 17. With the death of the Knights of Labor, working-class radicalism had few organized outlets. The Socialist Party was visibly active in the state around the turn of the century, claiming 400 members in 1908. The Socialists eventually attracted a small following among poor white farmers in Baldwin, Bibb, Covington, and Coleman counties and among a handful of Birmingham's skilled workers. It reached its peak in electoral strength in 1912 when Alabamians cast 3,029 votes, 2.6% of the state's electorate, for Eugene Debs. In Birmingham, the only socialist who held office was Arlie K. Barber, a staunchly anti-corporate suburban. 18. Unlike Louisiana and parts of Texas, where Southern socialists organized blacks, albeit in separate locals, in Alabama the SBA was strictly a white man's party. 19. In 1905, Montgomery Socialist E.F. Andrews maintained that organizing blacks, especially on an integrated basis, would have disastrous results. Northern socialists did not understand, he explained in 1905, that white Southerners were surrounded by some 8 millions of more or less civilized people, belonging to a race in a stage of evolution so far removed from our own that for aught we can see at present, assimilation must be impossible for an indefinite period. Like many other Southern socialists, Andrews believed the time was ripe for propagandizing the socialists' cause but feared organizing blacks would. 20. The decade after World War I was marked by unsettling social and economic transformations affecting all strata of Birmingham society. Following 2 decades of mercurial growth, conservative values clashed with the course of industrialization. Xenophobia, racism, and rigid moralism informed mainstream politics in Birmingham during the 1920s, lasting well into the 1930s. White supremacist groups organized by some of the city's leading citizens hoped to establish order and a degree of cultural homogenization through intimidation and violence. The Ku Klux Klan, in particular, enjoyed huge numerical and financial support during the 1920s, emerging as one of the city's most powerful political forces. Klansmen sought to cleanse their city of Jews, Catholics, labor agitators, and recalcitrant African Americans who refused to accept their place in the 21. A large number of poor whites were also drawn to this essentially middle-class Protestant movement, but their participation did not improve the squalid poverty many were forced to endure long before the stock market crash of 1929. Organized labor did not completely buy into the reactionary tendencies of Southern, Jazz Age, politics. Although industrial unionism lay prostrate, craft unions successfully fought for municipal reforms and sustained a dynamic involvement in local politics after World War I. Robert La Follette's Farmer Labor Party, for instance, received nearly 12% of the votes in Jefferson County. The Labor Advocate, Journal of the Birmingham Trades Council, sustained somewhat of an urban populist tradition. It not only fought rising rents in working-class neighborhoods but supported the single tax movement and called for municipal ownership of public utilities. A. H. Cather's Eclectic Southern Labor Review, though not an official publication of the Birmingham labor movement, combined both radical and conservative tendencies. Cather outrightly attacked capitalism, called for unity of farmers and workers, advocated cooperationism under Christian principles, yet was among the most avid supporters of the temperance. 22. Nonetheless, it is difficult to assess the impact of the labor press during the 1920s when all that remained of the labor movement after 1922 was fragmented craft unionism. Nativism, racism, and the violence which accompanied these attitudes served as an effective bulwark against the resurgence of an already emaciated labor movement. The war and post-war period altered black lives fundamentally. Northern employment opportunities and Southern injustice compelled a substantial portion of Southern blacks to make their way north, although several thousand rural migrants first tested the urban South. Because the expansion of Birmingham's industrial complex also drew vast numbers of black people from rural Alabama and Georgia into the steel and iron mills, the influx into the already overcrowded and highly segregated metropolis led to a deterioration of living conditions. Moreover, the country's failure to fulfill wartime promises of equality and the renewed militancy of returning war veterans left race relations in Birmingham unusually tense. Compounded by the struggles of black miners during the violent strikes of 1919 and 1920-21, post-war Birmingham could have erupted much like Chicago, indeed. 23. Nevertheless, the ways in which post-war black radicalism manifested itself in most of the country were not duplicated in Alabama. Besides emigration schemes that had no apparent connection with the UNIA, Garveyism had few organized followers among black Alabamians. In 1922, a small group of UNIA adherents lived in Neenah and Camden, Alabama, and a handful of North Birmingham residents read the Garveyite tabloid, The Negro World, and contributed funds to the UNIA nationally, but there is no evidence that in 24. By 1923, the UNIA had established divisions in Mobile and neighboring Pritchard, Alabama, but these chapters were quite small. In 1926, the Pritchard Division, Alabama's 25. Responding to racial tensions and rising expectations, branches of the NAACP were established in several Alabama cities, including Birmingham, Selma, Uniontown, Blockton, Anniston, Tuscaloosa, and Montgomery. These branches, established by black middle-class leaders, intended to redirect black resistance toward more respectable avenues. The Birmingham branch, for instance, grew directly out of the Colored Citizens League of Bessemer, an organization of ministers and businessmen founded in 1916. In 1919, the League created a committee on race relations in order to quell potential violence, and out of this post-war committee emerged the Birmingham 26. The NAACP in Alabama could not sustain the immediate post-war enthusiasm for black organization. Although the Birmingham chapter claimed nearly 1,000 members in 1919, in less than 3 years its membership dropped to a dismal 36, and in 1923 it reported only 14 dues-paying members. 5 years later, the branch ceased operating altogether. Similarly, the Montgomery branch, founded in 1918, ballooned to 600 in 1919, only to dwindle to a paltry 43 dues-paying members a year later. Ku Klux Klan intimidation and other forms of repression partly explain the rapid demise of the NAACP during the 1920s, but racial violence notwithstanding, the association's local leadership ignored the problems black working people faced daily. The Birmingham branch's agenda focused more on the city's black business interests than on racial violence, the denial of civil liberties, and the immediate problems confronting the poor. The black middle class's silence was broken briefly in 1926, however, by a black Birmingham school teacher named Indiana Little. 6 years after white women won the right to vote, Little led a predominantly female crowd of 1,000 to the steps 27. Of Jefferson County Courthouse and demanded an immediate end to black disfranchisement. City officials refused to hear her arguments and arrested her for vagrancy. In the final analysis, white middle-class reformism was more concerned with working people's moral behavior than their economic well-being, and black middle-class reformism, with its mild pleas for a junior partnership in democracy, was crushed to earth. Shorn of effective organization, workers approached a new decade on the threshold of economic disaster. The urban South began to feel the effects of the Great Depression as early as 1927, 2 years before the stock market crash. The Birmingham Trades Council reported an unemployment rate of 18% in February 1928, and between 1926 and 1929 the Jefferson County Red Cross's relief rolls more than doubled. Huge numbers of black and white workers were laid off in 1929 when TCI shut down 2 blast furnaces in Bessemer. A year later, coal production had reached its lowest level since 1921. Pig iron output had dropped by over 41%, and to exacerbate an already desperate situation, Jefferson County experienced a surge of migrants hoping to escape rural poverty. And although poor blacks, particularly recent arrivals from the rural areas, had suffered steady economic deterioration since the post-war recession, whites suddenly found themselves faced with similar circumstances. Most striking is the fact that the percentage of white workers on the county relief rolls jumped from 14.5% in 1926 to 32.5%. 28. By 1930, black and white working people had very little in the way of organizational power, and in the shadow of a decade of clan violence and racist backlash within the labor movement, the prospects of interracial unity seemed unrealizable. As the effects of the Depression began to take their toll, workers, particularly blacks, had few weapons against plant shutdowns and massive layoffs. We was up against some pretty rough terror. Those days was rough. You couldn't pity-pat with people. We had that we tell people, when you join, it's just like the army, but it's not the army of the bosses, it's the army of the working class, organizing to make things get better. Hosea Hudson. With our few pennies that we collected, we ground out leaflets on an old rickety mimeograph machine, which we kept concealed in the home of one of our workers. We were obliged to work very quietly, like the abolitionists in the South during the Civil War, behind drawn shades and locked doors. Angelo Herndon. We were the slaves in Pharaoh's land, you and he and I. And we were serfs to feudal hands now that time's gone by. Prentices in cities, prisoners for debt. Hunted vagrants, perish poor, our life is a lie. We move an invisible army. All of us together. Southern Labor Song, ca. 1930s. For communists eager to get on with the task of revolution, the South was a new, mysterious frontier. Arriving in Gastonia, North Carolina, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Greenville, South Carolina, and Birmingham, Alabama, they brought with them the cultural and ideological baggage of a northern, urban-based movement, including assumptions about the backwardness of Southern workers. Yet, gnawing at the edges of their preconceptions was a policy that situated Southern blacks at the heart of the region's revolutionary movement. Following nearly a decade of resolutions and reassessments on the Negro question, in 1928 the Sixth World Congress of the Communist International insisted that blacks concentrated in the Black Belt counties of the Deep South constituted an oppressed nation. This region, dominated by cotton plantations, consisted of counties with a numerical black majority. As an oppressed nation, the resolution maintained African Americans had the right to self-determination, political power, control over the economy, and the right to secede from the United States. In 1930 the resolution was altered to account for the differences between North and South. Northern blacks, the new resolution argued, sought integration and assimilation, and therefore the demand for self-determination was to be applied exclusively to the South. 1. The new position opened a new chapter in CUSA history. With the possible exceptions of B. H. Lauderdale, a white communist from Breckenridge, Texas, who tried unsuccessfully to place the Communist Party on the ballot in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama in 1922, and William Z. Foster, who orchestrated a Southern presidential campaign tour in 1928, the party never ventured south before 1929. Apparently unaware of the region's own history of working class and rural radicalism, national communist leaders presumed the South to be an impenetrable bastion of racist conservatism and derided the notion that Southern blacks had their own radical tradition. Communist John Owens opposed bringing Southern blacks into the party because the vast majority of Southern Negroes are not revolutionary, not even radical. Given a society of peace, prosperity, and 2. On the other hand, Southerners evaluated Northern radicals through their own ideological lenses. When the communists entered the Magic City to extend their form of immigrant, urban, working-class radicalism to the industrial South, they entered a world unaccustomed to Reds, outside the pale of mythology. Residents became familiar with communism through radio and newspapers or through hearsay and urban folklore. Stories of North Carolina textile strikers were hardly ignored by Southerners, black or 3. Popular myths of evil Reds wishing only to sow the seeds of discord were intended to neutralize the party's message. But the Depression had hit Alabama so hard that many working people, especially blacks, viewed hunger and joblessness as the greater evil. Thus, for some the communists were devils incarnate, for others they were avenging angels. But for all Birminghamians the CP was a new and strange addition to the Southern landscape. The Central Committee of the PUSA chose Birmingham, the center of heavy industry in the South, as headquarters for the newly established District 17, encompassing Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Florida, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Located on the fringe of the Black Belt, Birmingham also served as a jumping-off point for the organization of 4. The first full-time organizers in Birmingham were Tom Johnson and Harry Jackson, two veteran white communists who had been active trade union organizers in the North. Johnson had worked in Cleveland, and Harry Jackson had spent considerable time as a longshoreman in San Francisco. The precise moment of their arrival is rather hazy, but they were visibly active late in 1929, having established contact with Italian metalworker James Giglio before arriving. Giglio had earlier written to the CP-led TUL in New York and shortly thereafter established a Birmingham chapter of the Metalworkers Industrial League. Through Giglio, Johnson met with black TCI workers in Ensley, an industrial suburb of Birmingham, and subsequently recruited the first Communist Party unit at a street corner meeting in a black section of town. The party even opened an office downtown, 2117/2 2nd Avenue North, though its presence was brief. A few weeks later, on March 23, 1930, the TUL held its first mass meeting. Some 200 participants, about three-quarters of whom were black, piled into the Joy Boys Dance Hall in downtown Birmingham to hear speeches by Giglio, Tom Johnson, and Walter Lewis, a newly recruited black steel worker from Montgomery. The meeting went without incident, but within days Giglio's 5. The bombing was enough to convince party leaders to lie low for the next 2 months. Meanwhile, the Central Committee dispatched an additional veteran organizer to strengthen the Birmingham cadre. Fresh from a year in the Soviet Union, the 24-year-old New York-born Frank Burns had been an active communist since 1926. Bolstered by Burns's appointment, the party resumed its organizing efforts with a mass meeting on May 22, at which Tom Johnson delivered a poignant address before a sympathetic and predominantly black crowd of over 200. Citing examples of recent lynchings in Georgia and Texas to excoriate Southern racism, Johnson proposed the idea of black self-determination in the Black Belt, advocated social and economic equality for blacks, and was reported to have lauded the Soviet government. The other two speakers, Burns and Walter Lewis, called for the abolition of segregation in the city's cafes and public transportation and strongly condemned racism as the 6. The meeting made a lasting impression on several participants, including an 18-year-old black coal miner named Angelo Herndon, whose incarceration for organizing black and white workers in Atlanta 2 years later would make him one of the most celebrated black communists in the country. Born on May 6, 1913, in the steel and coal mining town of Wyoming, Ohio, Herndon and his 13 brothers and sisters grew up amid poverty. Herndon's mother, a very religious woman who had hoped young Angelo would choose the ministry as his livelihood, was left alone to care for 14 children after the death of her husband. At age 13, Herndon and one of his brothers left home in search of jobs, eventually finding work in the coal mines of Birmingham. The grueling labor and unfair practices of coal operators ignited a number of confrontations between groups of workers and foremen, encounters that would eventually play a significant role in Herndon's radicalization. Persuaded by the party's commitment to social justice and racial equality, Herndon joined the Communists and quickly became one of Birmingham's most active. 7. As the summer approached, Communists moved their gatherings from indoor halls to outdoor parks. In May, about 700 blacks and 100 whites gathered in Capitol Park to demand relief for unemployed workers and to protest the recent arrests of 6 communists in Atlanta. The organizers then led an impromptu march to the Birmingham Community Chest headquarters to demand immediate relief but were turned away by 8. The incident prompted City Commissioner Jimmy Jones to conduct a full-scale investigation into radical activities and to introduce a strict criminal anarchy ordinance to curb communism. Passed unanimously by the City Commission on June 17, 1930, the new ordinance made it unlawful for anyone to advocate criminal anarchy, by print or word of mouth, or to be a member of an organization which does so. Conviction could result in fines up to $100 and 9. In defiance of the new ordinance, the Communists held an open meeting to elect delegates to the National Convention on Unemployment in Chicago, and a few days later a group of 250 black workers attended a demonstration in Capitol Park. The party's disregard of the new law, compounded by heightened racial tension surrounding black Congressman Oscar DePriest's announced visit to Birmingham, induced greater police repression. During a demonstration in Wilson Park held on June 28, city detectives arrested several communists, including leading black organizer Gilbert Lewis, charging them with advocating social equality between whites and Negroes. Earlier that day, Tom Johnson and Oscar DePriest. 10. Throughout the summer, Birmingham police invoked the criminal anarchy ordinance to arrest known activists and raid the homes of black workers suspected of possessing radical literature. Although the arrests led to few convictions and the charges were usually dropped or reduced to 11. The constant harassment took its toll on party work. Conceding that the repression in the South was much greater than elsewhere, the District Bureau formulated plans for creating armed and unarmed defense corps in Birmingham and Chattanooga. The unarmed groups were to be trained in street fighting tactics to protect demonstrators and delay police, while the select armed corps was supposed to protect organizers in mining camps and other isolated areas. Although the armed defense corps were apparently never activated, communist leaders kept firearms for self-defense and occasionally pawned them when funds were low. When police raids failed to turn up documents, guns were often 12. In the midst of heightened police repression, the party initiated a Southern-based radical weekly and established a workers' school for its new recruits. At the behest of the Central Committee, 24-year-old James S. Allen Nassau Auerbach left his post as editor of the Labor Defender, the journal of the ILD, and traveled south with his wife and comrade, Isabel Allen, and a paltry sum of $200 to launch the Southern Worker. Dateline Birmingham. In order to confuse police, it was originally published in Chattanooga, where anti-communist repression was not as 13. The first issue of the Southern Worker appeared on August 16, 1930. Selling for 2 cents a copy, 3,000 copies were printed and distributed throughout Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Allen's first editorial statement described the new publication as a paper of and for both the white and black workers and farmers. It recognizes only one division, the bosses against the workers and the workers against the bosses. The only way to achieve the demands of the working class, he reasoned, was through proletarian revolution. Surprisingly, the editorial statement did not mention the party's position on self-determination in the Black Belt, and it contained very little discussion regarding the specific struggles of African Americans. The paper's credo notwithstanding, so much space was devoted to the problems of black working people that Southern-born white communists occasionally commented on the paper's perceived pro-black bias. In a letter to the editor, one white party member complained that he could not sell subscriptions for a paper that devotes 14. Allen had good reason to devote more space to black working people. From the beginning, Birmingham blacks exhibited a greater interest in the party than did whites. The Communists' original cadre of 3 organizers in 1929 was augmented to over 90 by the end of August 1930, and over 500 working people populated the party's mass organizations of 15. There was little doubt in the minds of district organizers that Negroes are the decisive strata among the toiling masses in the South. During the 1930 election campaign, the Communist Party did what no political party had done in Alabama since Reconstruction. It endorsed a black candidate, Walter Lewis, for governor. The election platform included complete racial equality and maintained that the exercise of self-determination in the Black Belt was the 16. Alarmed by the Communist Party's growing support among black working people, leading white citizens and government officials temporarily breathed a sigh of relief when a congressional committee to investigate communist propaganda under Congressman Hamilton Fish decided to hold hearings in Birmingham. Predictably, as the communists in Birmingham assailed the hearings as part of a sustained effort to outlaw the CP, local authorities and the press expressed confidence that the Fish Committee would end the radical menace once and for all. The hearings intensified anti-communist hysteria, as various witnesses described the intricate workings of a secret, foreign-led movement whose predominantly black ranks numbered up to 8,000 strong in Alabama alone. In retrospect, these exaggerations are astounding since the Birmingham CP. 17. The publicity surrounding the hearings did not hinder the party's growth that fall. Party units were established in 3 metal shops, in a mine, and on a cotton plantation some 40 miles north of Birmingham, and communists employed by the U.S. Pipe Company began publishing a shop newsletter entitled The Red Hammer. By late 1930, the party had spread beyond the borders of Jefferson County and gained a few adherents among white farmers and miners in the northern Alabama counties of Cullman, Winston, Walker, St. Clair, Morgan, and Marshall, a region with a Republican, populist, and to a lesser degree, socialist tradition. In January 1931, Tom Johnson helped a group of Cullman County farmers form the Alabama Farmers Relief Fund, an affiliate of the communist-led United Farmers League in North Dakota, and within 2 months at least 9 small locals. 18. At the 7th National Convention in June 1930, party leaders elected to postpone the ambitious industrial organizing drive in Alabama in favor of a campaign that would focus on the immediate needs of the jobless. Central Committee as well as local party leaders realized that, because of recent plant closures, the pressing need for work or relief eclipsed all other issues affecting Birmingham workers. The demand for jobs was so great that numerous independent efforts were launched by industrialists and middle-class organizations to relieve the situation. In addition to sponsoring public works projects, in 1930 the Chamber of Commerce worked out a plan through which meal tickets redeemable at participating restaurants could be purchased by needy citizens. The League of Women Voters instituted a clean up, paint up, repair up campaign in an attempt to relieve unemployment, but these efforts did little to remedy the situation. There was, however, one organized effort generated from the working class itself. That was independent of, and even hostile to, the Communist Party. In April 1930, white labor organizer John Bago formed an all-white unemployed organization with about 100 members. When one of its members suggested a march on City Hall to demand $50,000 from the Board of Revenue, Bago opposed the idea, labeling such a march communistic. Having achieved nothing tangible, the organization disbanded within a few. 19. As the winter approached, the CP stepped up its own relief campaign by holding a series of demonstrations to draw attention to the plight of the jobless. In preparation for a rally in Capitol Park in September, local communists issued a leaflet that spoke directly to Birmingham's growing number of homeless white and colored workers are being evicted from their homes and thrown out on the streets to shift for themselves. Gas and water is being cut off because the unemployed workers cannot pay their bills. Although police arrested organizers Angelo Herndon and Tom Johnson on the day of the rally, a large and restive crowd of blacks gathered. 20. A few weeks later, the Metal Workers Industrial League planned a mass meeting of unemployed steel workers in Ensley to demand immediate relief, an end to evictions, free light and heat for the city's jobless, and to reaffirm their support for a communist-sponsored social insurance bill that proposed minimum cash assistance of $25 per week to all unemployed workers. Under the slogan, "Organize and fight! Don't starve!" the League drew an estimated 2,500 steel workers, but the meeting was postponed after its principal speaker, Harry Jackson, was detained by police. One of the more dramatic instances of mass confrontation occurred on December 16, 1930. Joe Burton, an 18-year-old black YCL activist, led a spontaneous demonstration of workers who had congregated at a bridge construction site seeking work. Burton persuaded the crowd, which had grown to nearly 5,000 according to party sources, to storm the lobby of the Hotel Morris and demand jobs. 21. The vast majority of Birmingham poor probably thought the communists were fighting a lost cause. The political and financial power of the city's corporate interests seemed unassailable to most people, and the militance with which the communists challenged authority might have appeared suicidal. The Depression certainly devastated most working families, but economic need alone did not drive large numbers of unemployed into the arms of the Communist Party. Sons and daughters of the land, many black workers had lived through winters as sharecroppers with few resources available, and had learned dozens of creative methods of survival. In addition to performing odd jobs in exchange for food, obtaining grocery store throwaways, selling roasted peanuts on the streets, and hauling and selling firewood, coal was appropriated from the mines and railroads and sold or used as fuel. Empty homes were occasionally torn apart by the poor desperately in need of fuel. Individuals who might not have benefited directly from the stolen wood took advantage of the vacancies by obtaining free rent in exchange for protecting some landlords' private property. 22. Urban cultivation was the most common survival strategy, as both a source of additional food as well as cash income. During the Depression, one Birmingham woman recalls, "Everybody had chickens, hogs, and a garden." Urban gardens proliferated rapidly during the Depression. In Jefferson County, the number of farms increased 94% between 1930 and 1935, yet the average size per farm decreased from 53.4 acres to 30.6 acres. Jobless and underemployed workers invested in various forms of livestock, from milk cows to pigs, and plots of land were cultivated, ranging in size from small vegetable gardens to 30 or 40-acre farms. Cultivation generally took place on company property in the coal and ore mines as well as in the industrial suburbs and back alleys. A 1934 study of Birmingham's working-class communities located 7,595 pigs and 1,996. 23. These methods of survival kept some families off the relief rolls, but for most unemployed or workers whose hours had been cut back substantially, welfare was also a necessary supplement. TCI's elaborate welfare system, established just before the outbreak of World War I, was extremely limited. Workers paid all health care expenses through monthly fees levied on their paychecks, and although TCI provided unemployed relief, such assistance had to be paid back. Employees unable to pay rent on company-owned. 24. Homes were not automatically evicted. The accumulated rent payments were deferred to a later date, and heat, electricity, and water were cut off immediately. In an effort to curtail unemployment, the City Commission proposed a $500,000 bond issue early in 1931 to create employment opportunities through public works projects. The 1,200 jobs it created, however, paid only 25 cents an hour for 3 8-hour days. The city's relief program, in the eyes of one black worker, was worse than slavery. "In slavery times, I am told, the master would put good shirts and overalls on you, and today we can't even eat on $6 a week." The communists assailed the plan as a scheme to cut wages that would result in a bureaucratic haven for graft and corruption. In its place, the party called for a government relief program that would provide the unemployed with a weekly minimum of $10 cash relief, free coal, car fare, and a minimum of $20 per 25 week for city relief jobs, and would protect the jobless from evictions and utilities shutoffs. Municipal and county governments' inadequate resources left the Red Cross to bear the brunt of Birmingham's relief needs. Its monthly expenditures increased from $6,000 in 1929 to $180,000 by July 1933, and the number of cases rose from 450 in 1929 to 20,914 in 1933. The Red Cross's case load was supposed to have been transferred back to city and county governments in 1930, but the city could not afford the burden and county officials refused the undertaking. The paltry $1,000 monthly subsidy. 26. Birmingham's unemployed found little beneficence working for the Red Cross, whose public improvement projects involved demolishing abandoned buildings, rebuilding rural schools, draining lowland areas, and gardening. In a letter to the Daily Worker, a black Birmingham worker complained that the Red Cross boss stands with a pistol over us while we work, like we are prisoners working out a term. These conditions were compounded by the fact that the Red Cross's relief payments were among the lowest in the country. To make matters worse, by August 1932 the Birmingham Red Cross had stopped providing cash relief altogether. 27. Throughout the spring and summer of 1931, the party and the unemployed councils held a series of demonstrations against the Red Cross in North Birmingham, calling for a complete boycott of the Birmingham Community Chest. The unemployed councils also sent a communication to the governor and the state legislature criticizing the Red Cross's efforts as inadequate and demanding that the issue of unemployment relief take precedence over all questions before the legislature. The council's leaders requested, among other things, free utilities for all unemployed and underemployed workers, provisions for opening all schools and free lunch for school children, and the right to vote without restrictions and 28. Having little faith in petitions and boycotts, communists organized neighborhood relief committees to present their demands to the Birmingham Welfare Board and to deal with members' specific grievances on an individual basis. These committees also fought evictions and foreclosures, but unlike militants in New York or Chicago, they tried to avoid confrontations with authorities by adopting more evasive tactics, ranging from flooding landlords with postcards and letters to simple reasoning. Representatives of the unemployed councils often dissuaded landlords from evicting their tenants by describing the potential devastation that could occur once an abandoned house became a free-for-all for firewood. When a family's electricity was shut off for non-payment, activists from the unemployed council frequently used heavy-gauge copper wires as jumpers to appropriate electricity from public outlets or other homes. Council members also found ways to reactivate water mains after they had been turned off, though the process was more complicated than pilfering electricity. And in at least one instance, a group of black women used verbal threats to stop a city employee from turning off one family's water. 29. Women frequently assumed leadership in the neighborhood relief committees, usually because the economic downturn directly impinged upon their designated roles as mothers, housewives, and workers. Black female domestics experienced layoffs, speed-ups. Employers used the threat of competition to extract more work over less time, and wage cuts because of overall cutbacks in the use of paid household labor, and the increasing utilization of labor-saving devices. Without the benefit of sick pay, vacations, or regular hours, some women toiled in white kitchens for as low as $1.50 to $2 per week. Wages were so low during the 1930s that many women earned just enough to pay their rent and live day-to-day on the 30. According to the 1930 census, approximately 82% of, or 16,000, black female wage earners were engaged in domestic services, and in 1935 at least 8,000 black female. 31. The lack of domestic work was compounded by the dearth of employment opportunities for women. Dominated by the steel, iron ore, and coal mining industries of the Birmingham-Bessemer industrial complex, most other avenues for employment were closed to black and white working women. Because most black working-class families relied on two incomes, women usually combined wage labor and housework. As conditions worsened, the burden of providing for their families increasingly fell upon the shoulders of women, especially black single mothers in the city. With few job opportunities and the burden of child-rearing, women were more dependent than men on various forms of private and public relief. Moreover, some husbands chose to leave so that their families might receive more relief, because of domestic conflict, or in some cases because 32. The neighborhood relief committees became the key organizations for attracting black women to the CP. Helen Longs, a cleaning woman in a furniture store and a mother, joined the party because of its opposition to the Red Cross. Estelle Milner, a young black school teacher in Birmingham, became a communist through her work with the urban and rural poor. In addition to organizing sharecroppers in Tallapoosa County, she led a group of Birmingham women who fought for reforms in public health care. This cadre of women radicals, which included other leaders such as Cornelia Foreman, Alice Mosley, and an elderly bookkeeper named Addie Adkins, won the admiration of their neighbors and comrades. Communist organizer and novelist Myra Page described this group of black Birmingham women, who fought to get them women out of their kitchens, in a series of short 33. The struggle for welfare and other forms of relief also attracted a tiny group of working-class white women to the unemployed councils and subsequently into the ranks of the CP. Alabama-born communist Mary Leonard succeeded in bringing together a group of 5 white women, under the auspices of the unemployed councils, that confronted officials at the city's welfare board and won several demands, including food, clothing, and 34. Food and supplies were not the only issues in the women's fight against the Red Cross and city welfare. Birmingham relief applicants resented the social workers' harsh, condescending manner, and many demanded to be 35. Perhaps the worst aspect of relief was dealing with investigators who visited homes unannounced to determine whether an applicant was truly in need. Red Cross and city welfare officials occasionally required applicants to sell personal belongings considered superfluous, such as radios, watches, clothes, or new furniture. Possession of too much food or a large garden could result in an immediate cancellation of assistance. One Birmingham resident remembers the demeaning practice in which investigators would look in your sugar. Look. In your trunk. In your wheelbarrow. All the way through the house. See if you had anything hid. Welfare agents often enlisted the help of residents willing to spy on their neighbors in exchange for a larger grocery order or a 36. But hiding groceries, livestock, and personal items from relief authorities was necessary for survival. Black party leaders, most of whom were on the relief rolls themselves, understood the importance of this tactic in the black community. Communist-led vigilance committees were created to visit suspected stool pigeons and strongly advise them to cease their activities. If this tactic failed, Hosea Hudson recalls, we start to bombard them with postcards. This practice characterized most radical opposition in Birmingham. Dramatic marches popularized the struggle for relief and no doubt applied some pressure on welfare authorities to provide meaningful assistance to the poor, but more individualized forms of resistance, or oppositional practices, proved to be effective weapons of the weak in everyday life. Local communists sustained this individualized tradition in a collective setting by defending the community's right to hide food and personal items. They confronted not the welfare agent but the 37. The party's fight against inadequate relief measures and expanding unemployment brought a few hundred workers into its ever-widening circle, but there were other critical areas for rank-and-file involvement that had nothing to do with obtaining food. The communist-led ILD attracted national attention for its defense of 9 young black men accused of raping 2 white women near Paint Rock, Alabama, in March 1931. The campaign to free the Scottsboro Boys boosted party popularity in Birmingham's black communities almost overnight. About the same time, communists began organizing a union of black sharecroppers and poor farmers in the eastern Piedmont counties of rural Alabama. The union's involvement in a gun battle with police in Tallapoosa County contributed immensely to the Alabama Party's national reputation. As these activities became front-page news, ordinary black workers skeptical of white radical promises began to take a second look at the Communist Party, the ILD, and the neighborhood. 38. The Scottsboro campaign and the unemployed movement attracted precisely the kind of local leaders that were needed to strengthen the party's ties with the black community. Al Murphy, who proved to be an exceptionally adept organizer, joined the CP and the YCL in 1930. Born in 1908 to poor sharecropping parents in McRae, Georgia, Murphy was raised for the most part by his grandparents after his father died, although his mother continued to support him on meager earnings from domestic work and cotton picking. He grew up in a strongly religious and race-conscious household. His grandfather, an African Methodist Episcopal minister, had been a presiding elder under Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, a nationally prominent advocate of black emigration to Africa, and his grandmother also became a self-made Methodist minister. As a teenager, he moved in with his aunt and uncle in Tuscaloosa and made his living digging ditches, picking cotton, unloading coal, and working in a pipe foundry handling dangerous, corrosive chemicals. In 1923, Murphy moved to Birmingham only to find more backbreaking labor and low wages. This life did not squash his long-term aspirations, however. He enrolled in night school to continue his education, which had come to an abrupt halt in the 4th grade, so that he could pursue a career as a public speaker and carve a niche for himself in the limited area of Negro politics. When the Depression hit Birmingham, he recalled, I had to stop night school and join workers on the bread lines. Then one autumn Sunday morning in 1930 he noticed a leaflet which read, Stop lynching, full rights for the Negro people, down with imperialist war. Shortly thereafter, Frank Williams, his friend and recent communist recruit, escorted Murphy to a local unemployed meeting that so impressed him he joined that night. Murphy subsequently immersed himself in party work, attending Marxist education classes regularly, and recruiting black steel workers at the Stockholm plant in 39. Al Murphy, photographed in 1977, courtesy Southern Historical Collection, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Among those Murphy recruited from the Stockholm plant was Hosea Hudson, a fellow iron worker born in Wilkes County, Georgia, in 1898, whose early life resembled Murphy's in many ways. Hudson, too, grew up in an extended family consisting of his mother, brother, and grandmother in rural Georgia. After his mother remarried in 1913 and left the family, 15-year-old Hosea took up sharecropping to support his remaining family members. He married in 1917 and continued sharecropping nearly debt-free until the boll weevil wiped out his crop in 1921. Failing to secure steady employment in Atlanta in 1923, Hudson and his family moved to Birmingham, where he found work as an iron molder at the Stockham foundry. Like Murphy and Angelo Herndon, Hudson had no trade union experience before the 1930s but possessed a strong personal intolerance for racial injustice. And also like Murphy, Hudson was the ideological product of elders who lived through the revolutionary times of Reconstruction. I always did resent injustice and the way they used to treat Negroes, he recalls. My grandmother used to talk about these things. She was very militant herself, you know. Hudson tried to organize fellow employees independently in the late 1920s, but when members could not agree on the organization's purpose and direction, he abandoned the idea. After having ignored the CP in Birmingham for over a year, Hudson's interest in communism was suddenly piqued by the Scottsboro case. Sympathetic to the defendants and the efforts of the ILD, Hudson enthusiastically accepted Murphy's cautious invitation to explore what the party had to offer, and at a meeting in September 1931, he and everyone else in attendance opted to 40. Through the efforts of individuals such as Hudson and Murphy, the circle widened to include Andy Brown, Joe Howard, Saul Davis, John David James, Mac Code, Henry O. Mayfield, John Baydell, and other stalwarts who later became respected party organizers and labor leaders. All of these individuals had southern rural roots, limited education, and were unskilled or semi-skilled laborers in Birmingham's coal and steel industry. They were all very active in their respective churches and some, particularly Hudson, Baydell, and Mayfield. 41. The higher echelons of party leadership also underwent significant changes during this period. In 1931, District Organizer Tom Johnson left Alabama for health reasons, and Harry Jackson stepped in to take his place. Based mainly in Chattanooga, Jackson spent much of his time traveling from place to place overseeing local party work. But early in 1932, District 17 was reconstructed under the leadership of Nat Ross and Ted Wellman. Unlike Johnson and Jackson, Ross and Wellman were intellectuals in the formal sense of the word. The New York-born Wellman, who adopted the name Sid Benson during his tenure in Birmingham, was remembered by a sympathetic Alabamian professor for his Marxian interpretation of a Haydn symphony. Born of Russian Jewish background and a graduate of Columbia University, Nat Ross had briefly attended Harvard Law School and initiated work toward a doctorate at Columbia before joining the party. In 1929, after working as an organizer in southern Illinois for a while, he 42. A rigid theoretician, Ross restructured the party according to Leninist principles of organization. Unbending discipline and regular meetings were the order of the day. Unlike the black women who rose to crucial middle-level leadership positions, white women communists for the most part were relegated to mimeograph machines and occasional public speaking. Soon after joining the Communist Party in Chicago, Alice Burke followed her husband Donald Burke to Birmingham, where he had been appointed regional secretary of the ILD. Arriving in the spring of 1932, she was described as a local party leader in press reports, but in reality she had no role in the district committee and was practically excluded from decision-making. I was just a wife, she recalls, and I went where the husband was assigned to. I had no role at all, except as a rank-and-file Jimmy Higgins worker. Nevertheless, she made tremendous sacrifices for the party that were hardly acknowledged. For instance, although Burke was arrested along with Wirt Taylor in November 1932 and served 8 weeks in a Birmingham jail, she was not mentioned in communist press reports that detailed Taylor's heroic struggle for freedom. But perhaps her biggest sacrifice occurred when she had to send her newborn daughter to California for 3 years to live with her sister because of the dangers Birmingham. 43. White women rarely challenged their designated roles within the party during the early 1930s, but there were some who ignored conventions, both within communist circles and society as a whole, and in some ways exhibited an incipient feminist consciousness. Two leading Southern-born female iconoclasts in the party, Mary Leonard and Jane Speed, ironically were products of two different social worlds. Mary Leonard, born and raised of working-class background and the widow of a local druggist, carved out her own leadership position through her powerful speaking ability, and by building a small base of support among poor white housewives. The heavy-set and outspoken Leonard, whose confrontational and cavalier attitude toward police and government officials often made her comrades nervous, was also remembered for her unconventional private life. I don't think she was married, Alice Burke recalled. But she'd date. 44. Jane Speed, on the other hand, described in the Daily Worker as a handsome auburn-haired girl with an appearance so demure you'd never guess the militant struggles in which she has taken part, was known to be far more discreet privately and less threatening to her male comrades. She was immediately accepted within leadership circles because She had the presentation of an educated person, an important attribute in a Marxist organization comprised largely of illiterate and semi-literate working people. Born to a very wealthy Southern family, Jane and her mother, Mary Martin Craik Speed, known affectionately as Dolly, became active in left-wing circles while Jane was a student in Vienna, Austria, in the late 1920s. After returning to Alabama in 1931, the 21-year-old nouveau radical devoted her energy to the American CP, organizing black and white unemployed in the streets of Birmingham and daily challenging her designation as a Southern. 45. In light of the anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and discrimination many European immigrants experienced upon their arrival in Birmingham, communists might have expected substantial support from the city's Italian, Jewish, Greek, and Slavic populations. During the 1920s, Italians and Jews were victims of clan attacks, and some Bulgarian and Greek coal miners earned less than blacks during the early part of the century. Moreover, the Russian Jewish émigrés who brought to America, particularly New York, radical traditions incubated by the 1905 revolution were conspicuously silent in Birmingham. While discrimination and ghettoization sometimes contributed to ethnic radicalization in other urban areas, Birmingham was unique in that these ethnic groups had greater opportunities for upward social mobility. Italians, for instance, moved into family-owned groceries with relative ease, tapping a black working-class consumer market anxious to escape company commissaries. By the 1930s, Italians operated some 300 grocery stores in the Birmingham area. Jews, too, climbed the economic ladder rather swiftly, although they were denied access to the mainstream bourgeoisie's social institutions and thus remained sort of a pariah middle class. Equally important is the fact that racist and anti-communist propaganda hindered potential Jewish support because their well-being and continued upward mobility often depended on their willingness to distance themselves from blacks, and the anti-Semitic overtones of Southern red-baiting forced the Jewish community to reject. 46. The few Southern whites who entered the communist rank and file during this period, if for only a fleeting moment, were usually unemployed industrial workers from the Birmingham district and coal miners and poor farmers from northern Alabama who had a tradition of voting Republican, populist, and socialist. In fact, about one-fifth of the communist vote in 1932 came from northern counties. Many of these supporters, especially the poor upcountry farmers, had little tolerance for African Americans and exhibited a kind of populist, class-oriented view of their problems. Their opposition to the planter class and the big meals, combined with the 47 inches fact, several white recruits were reportedly former KKK members. These Klansmen gone red, along with other Southern whites who exhibited racial prejudice, grudgingly conceded that blacks had to be organized in order to improve their own conditions. As a white Birmingham steel worker succinctly put it at a party unit meeting in 1931, "We got to get together and." 48. The party's primary focus on African Americans, for the most part, alienated native white sympathizers. A former member of the Socialist Party who joined the Communists in 1930 argued that if the party concentrated exclusively on whites, they would carry the whole South in the elections. This was not just a tactical suggestion, however. After the Proletarian Revolution, he explained, black people would have to be 49. Needless to say, the author of this letter was summarily expelled. As an organization militantly anti-racist and consciously interracial, the party initially rejected or expelled whites who exhibited racial prejudice. By 1932, Nat Ross was highly critical of this policy. The most important reason for the party's failure among whites, Ross argued, was its refusal to accept in our mass organization white workers who still had traces of race prejudice. Ross believed that joint action between blacks and whites would illustrate to white workers the merits of interracial unity, and in the process, break the prejudice of the Southern white workers. But the policy was not very successful, for as Clyde Johnson recalled, when Ross and Ted Wellman assigned white Southerners to direct a unit in a black neighborhood, these white organizers were usually ostracized by their friends and neighbors, thus forcing them to choose between the party and 50. Southern whites were not only expected to change their lives and attitudes practically overnight, but Northern communists' condescending and sometimes insensitive attitude toward Southerners probably contributed to their high turnover. At a district committee meeting, for example, Tom Johnson warned those in attendance not to forget that the workers from the South are backward and we must not be too harsh in our dealings with them. And more than one local organizer cringed upon reading James Allen's ahistorical passage. Gone are the days of silence. The weary backs of the Southern masses no longer bend meekly. New on the fighting front, they have not yet advanced to the organizational stage of Northern. 51. On the other hand, few white Alabamians even entertained the idea of becoming communists. Anti-communist propaganda, rooted in popular myths and indisputably couched in the language of race, proved a mighty deterrent to Southern white support for the CP. Social equality, was such a potent, all-encompassing anti-communist slogan that the party's demand for black self-determination, with its separatist implication, was surprisingly ignored in the Southern press or in the various forms of Southern anti-communist propaganda. The cry of social equality, with all its multiple, specifically sexual, meanings and apparent ambiguities, was particularly effective because it symbolized the ultimate threat to white supremacy, class power, civilization, and Southern rulers' most precious property, white women. Headlines appeared in Birmingham's newspapers that read, "Communists tell Negroes to force social equality throughout the South," or "Negroes are urged to get social equality." Leaders of the Birmingham Trades and Labor Council responded similarly, using the local labor press to wage an all-out war against communism. The labor advocate labeled communists agitators from Moscow who openly preach social equality for the black race. Any man who seeks to disturb the 52 relations between the races is a dangerous character, and should be squelched now. The Fish Committee hearings held in 1930 provide a window into the dominant beliefs many white Birmingham residents held with respect to communism. Everyone who testified at the Birmingham hearing agreed that the quintessential crime perpetrated by the Reds was the stirring up of race antagonisms. Witnesses argued forcefully that the doctrine of communism was tantamount to social equality, and that its perpetrators were all foreign-born Jews exploiting black ignorance. In their quest to prove the conspiratorial nature of the Communist Party in Birmingham, much of the testimony bordered on the absurd. Klansman John G. Murphy claimed Ohio-born communist Angelo Herndon was half Chinese and half Negro, and state investigator Ahmed Mundo testified that Frank Burns's real name was Shan Tiang, a direct descendant of a man by the name of Ng, who was one of a group of 21 headed by Leon Trotsky. Mundo further concurred with others that the party had planned a violent insurrection in Birmingham and, with their unlimited funds, had purchased the necessary hardware. The chairman: "You say the Communist Party had shipped her gas bombs?" Mr. Mundo: "Yes, sir." The chairman: "What makes you believe that?" Mr. Mundo: "A shipment was received here by one of the express companies, about the last of August, and it was labeled tear gas bombs, and came from one of the dealers in obsolete government supplies in Washington." 53. The popular perception of communists as foreigners and nigger lovers, whose sole purpose was to wage a race war in the South, created a huge barrier between these northern white idealists and Alabama's white working-class communities. No matter how many white Southerners agreed with the party's program, the Reds were still outsiders who had no roots among white Alabamians. Herein lies a strange irony. The Central Committee dispatched white communists from the North to organize working people in a highly segregated environment, but because the movement attracted overwhelming numbers of black working people, it was virtually impossible to develop and sustain close contacts with their constituency. Southern whites, with whom they could more easily meet because they shared the same social space and faced fewer legal hurdles, rejected and even attacked the Communist Party. Members of Birmingham's white cadre were essentially social pariahs in the white community, yet social and legal sanctions hampered personal relations with their black comrades. Thus two separate parties were formed, a large, broad-based organization of Southern blacks and a tiny cadre of Northern whites, supported by a few local people, which met together occasionally in secret hideaways or in streets and parks during open demonstrations. As the harsh winter of 1931-32 gave way to spring, it became increasingly clear that the party's future was directly tied to black working people, particularly the unemployed. In May, Hosea Hudson, Joe Howard, and Andy Brown led a mass march of some 200 dissatisfied black relief workers who had been forced by local social workers to perform laborious road work in exchange for relief. Between 125 and 150 showed up for the 3-mile march, but toward the end their numbers began to dwindle and only about 50 marchers arrived on the steps of City Hall. An elected committee of 6, headed by black YCL leader Joe Burton, was intercepted by police when they tried to meet with City Commissioner Jimmy Jones. The crowd eventually dispersed after Burton was knocked down by several officers and guns were drawn on the crowd. Bloodied and staggering, Burton declared the communists would return, next time with larger. 54. Several months later, local communists made good on Burton's promise. The November 7 demonstration was the largest communist-led demonstration in Alabama's history, attracting an overwhelmingly black crowd of 5,000 to 7,000. As people gathered outside the Jefferson County Courthouse, Wirt Taylor, a white Birmingham-born communist, and Alice Burke were carted away by police. The arrests failed to dampen the enthusiasm of the growing crowd, which was dominated by a vocal group of black women carrying baskets, bags, and the belief that food would be distributed to the protesters. Mary Leonard led an interracial delegation to meet with Jimmy Jones and present the Unemployed Council's demands for food and cash relief and unrestricted voting rights for all citizens. Jones, who was surrounded by police officers, ignored the delegation's demands and merely questioned Leonard as to whether or not she believed in social equality. When she replied that blacks were just as good as you and I, Jones asked the group to leave, and the police began to disperse the crowd. 55. 3 weeks later, crowds once again gathered in front of the courthouse steps to demonstrate against starvation and unemployment. Under the auspices of the National Committee of Unemployed Councils, several thousand Negro and white workers, according to party sources, attended a meeting to greet Column 6 of the National Hunger Marchers who had left from New Orleans en route to the national demonstration in Washington, D.C. Following a brief outbreak of violence between police and demonstrators, keynote speaker Alice Mosley, a young black communist organizer from the industrial suburb of Greenwood, was arrested along with 56. These mass demonstrations also coincided with the party's election campaign. For the first time in their history, the communists were able to register with Jefferson County and state registrars and have their candidates officially placed on the ballot. In addition to campaigning on behalf of the party's presidential candidates, William Z. Foster and his running mate, James Ford, the Birmingham cadre put up their own congressional candidates. The two communist candidates were Lee Parsons, a black worker who ran for Birmingham's 9th congressional district seat, and Andrew Forsman, a veteran white radical who made a bid for the Senate. A pioneer organizer for the Knights of Labor, Forsman had run for senator a decade earlier on the socialist ticket and for a brief moment had served as the president of the Mobile Trades Council. While Parsons's candidacy was probably looked upon with great interest by the mass of disfranchised blacks, the party's vice presidential candidate, James Ford, probably had even greater appeal since he was also a native of Alabama and a former 57. Obtaining votes, however, was clearly not the objective of the campaign. Voting, one leaflet explained, would not lead to workers' empowerment. That could only come through the direct seizure of factories, mines, and warehouses and self-determination for African Americans in the Black Belt. Calling for working-class unity across racial lines, the party's campaign focused mainly on the plight of Southern blacks, who were treated just like dogs by the bosses. While the platform demanded self-determination in the Black Belt, the central thrust was black-white unity. It is clear there is only one way out of hunger and death, and that is to break down the walls of 58. Segregation, Jim Crowism, and lynching by a united front of all poor people, white and colored, against the bosses and landlords, for bread and freedom. In October, Birmingham's radicals hosted a communist campaign meeting to be addressed by none other than William Z. Foster. Some leading white citizens regarded Foster's appearance as an indication that Birmingham was becoming a target for a communist takeover. City Commissioner Jimmy Jones tried to comfort one concerned citizen who feared the consequences of Foster's presence by assuring that if the communist leader makes any remarks that are in violation of the law, he will be arrested while in Birmingham. The Klan sent Foster a chilling warning in the form of a brief telegram stating, "Your presence in 59. Birmingham, Alabama, Sunday, October 9th is not wanted. Send nigger Ford." By the time the telegram arrived, however, Foster had already postponed his campaign tour because of illness. Clarence Hathaway, then the editor of the Daily Worker and secretary of the National Communist Election Campaign Committee, continued Foster's whirlwind tour of the South, speaking in Tennessee, Georgia, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Florida. Scheduled to address a Birmingham meeting on October 9th, Hathaway was detained by the police in New Orleans the night before and never appeared. Unaware of Hathaway's arrest, the meeting went on as planned, drawing some 1,200 people to the Lyric Theater, a popular local black theater in North Birmingham. There were a few sympathetic whites in the audience, but the majority were hecklers attempting to disrupt the meeting. Despite Hathaway's failure to appear, the meeting went rather smoothly after Fred Keith mounted the podium and gave an impromptu speech about the election campaign, the unemployed movement, and the Scottsboro case. The meeting ended abruptly, however, after a group of Klansmen in the 60. When the votes were counted, the Foster Ford ticket polled a surprising 726 votes, a significant number considering that its main constituency, black workers, were disfranchised. Most of the votes, however, were from counties where the Sharecroppers Union was active and from northern Alabama, where the party was slowly building a following among poor white farmers. Jefferson County only polled 33 communist votes in the presidential race, although Lee Parsons culled 133 votes from 61. Once the electoral campaign ended, the devastating winter of 1932-33 created a new set of problems. The relief rolls grew tremendously, and by 1933, 26,000 blacks, nearly 27% of Birmingham's total. 62. Stepping up its fight for relief in and around Birmingham, the party planned a mass unemployed demonstration on May 1st in recognition of International Workingmen's Day. Focusing on the failure of municipal and private relief efforts, the party not only demanded more meaningful assistance but vowed to stop the insults of the Red Cross when we go for our relief checks. There was a sense of irony in their final plea for full freedom of speech and assembly since the city commission decided to revoke their parade permit at the last minute. The illegality of the gathering and police warnings did not deter the nearly 3,000 people who showed up at Ingram Park. The demonstrators were met by police officers, white legionnaires, and Klansmen who forced them out of the park and onto the sidewalk. Jane Speed, who had been standing amidst a sea of black women, stepped up on the bumper of a car and began to address the crowd before police quickly arrested her. As she was whisked away in a patrol car, Speed dramatically screamed to the cordon of black participants, "Fellow workers, this is the way they do us." What began as a shoving match with police deteriorated to an all-out street fight. Police officers on the scene attacked the crowd with pistols drawn, but they were ordered not to use them. When one officer shoved his gun into the body of a black woman, she shouted, "Shoot me and you shoot 1,000 more." At a party meeting the very next day, a group of black women excitedly inquired as to the time and place of the next 63. The May Day battle was not the communists' last confrontation with police in the streets of Birmingham, but over the next few months the party's priorities began to shift from helping the jobless to organizing the unorganized. With the enactment of the FARA in May 1933, which meant a congressional appropriation of over $9 million for emergency relief for Alabama, and the creation of the CWA that same winter, thousands were lifted from the relief rolls. But more importantly, because the NERA facilitated the reorganization of the labor movement, Birmingham communists turned increasingly to their original goal of organizing. 64. The unemployed campaign was the key to the party's growth and consolidation in Birmingham. By the end of 1933, the party's dues-paying membership in Birmingham rose to nearly 500, and its mass. 65. The relief campaign was crucial to the formation of a local cadre, serving especially to increase the number of black female members, who often proved more militant than their male comrades. Furthermore, the various tactics developed in the relief campaign, from open confrontation to hidden forms of resistance, would later prove invaluable to local communists continuing their work in the mines, mills, and plantations of the Black Belt. 50 cents a day, Lord, for working in the field, just 4 bits, Lord, for a good strong hand from dawn to dark, Lord, from can till can't, ain't no way, Lord, a man can come out. They's got to be a way, Lord, show us the way. And then they sang. Go down, Moses, was the song they sang. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. John Beecher. The rural world communist organizers entered in 1930-31 made the poverty-stricken streets of Birmingham look like a paradise. Cotton farmers were in the midst of a crisis at least a decade old. After World War I, cotton prices plummeted, forcing planters to reduce acreage despite rising debts, and the boll weevil destroyed large stretches of the crop. When the stock market collapsed and cotton prices reached an all-time low, the real victims were small landholders who were forced into tenancy and tenants whose material well-being deteriorated even further. 1. It is no coincidence, therefore, that black farmers straddling the line between tenancy and ownership formed the nucleus of Alabama's communist-led rural movement. Within the limited world of cotton culture existed a variety of production relations. Cash tenants, more often white than black, usually leased land for several years at a time, supplied their own implements, draft animals, seed, feed, and fertilizer, and farmed without supervision. Share tenants, on the other hand, might own some draft animals and planting materials, but the landowner provided any additional equipment, shelter, and if necessary, advances of cash, food, or other subsistence goods such as clothing. Verbal contracts were made annually and the landowner generally marketed the crop, giving the tenant between 3/4 and 2/3 of the price, minus any advances or previous debts. The most common form of tenancy in the South was sharecropping. Virtually property-less workers paid with a portion of the crops raised. Sharecroppers had little choice but to cultivate cotton, the landowner's choice of staple crops. The landowner supplied the acreage, houses, draft animals, planting materials, and nearly all subsistence necessities, including food and cash advances. These furnishings were then deducted from the sharecropper's portion of the crop at an incredibly high interest rate. The system not only kept most tenants in debt, but it perpetuated living conditions that bordered on intolerable. Landowners furnished entire families with poorly constructed 1- or 2-room shacks, usually without running water or adequate sanitary facilities. Living day-to-day on a diet of fatback, beans, molasses, and cornbread, most Southern tenants suffered from nutritional deficiencies. Pellagra and rickets were 2. Sharecropping family, near Eutaw, Alabama, photographed by Dorothea Lang, Farm Security Administration, courtesy Library of Congress. The gradations of tenancy must be understood in relation to both race and the geographic distribution of cotton production. The Black Belt, the throne of King Cotton in Alabama, with its rich, black, calcareous clay soil, still resembled its antebellum past in that blacks outnumbered whites 4-3. As with other cotton-growing areas, the plant's life cycle and seasonal needs determined the labor and living patterns of those who worked the land. In early spring, after the land had thawed and dried from winter, cotton farmers plowed and fertilized rows in preparation for planting, which followed several weeks later. When the young plants began to sprout, the cotton had to be chopped, grass and weeds were removed, and the stalks separated so that they did not grow too close together. If this was not done regularly, the crop could be lost. Picking time, the most intense period of labor involving all family members, began around September 1st and continued through October. Once the cotton had been picked, ginned, baled, and sold, accounts were settled between the tenant and the landowner. The tenants, who usually found themselves empty-handed after settling accounts, cultivated gardens to survive the winter, begged for food and cash advances, or spent several days without anything to eat. And throughout the entire year, particularly during the lean winters, tenants hauled firewood, cut hay, repaired their homes, fences, tools, and watering holes, cared for their stock, cleared trees, and removed 4. Women's lives were especially hard in the world of cotton culture. Rising before dawn in the rest of family, the wives and daughters of tenant farmers prepared meals over a wood stove or open fire, fetched water from distant wells or springs, washed laundry by hand in pots of boiling water, toted firewood, tended livestock, made preserves, dyes, clothes, and medicinal remedies, ground cornmeal, gathered eggs, and tried to keep a house that generally lacked screens, windows, indoor plumbing, and electricity tidy. Women also worked in the fields, especially during picking and chopping time, and in the midst of physically exacting labor they bore and raised children. Many had little choice but to take in laundry or perform domestic work for meager wages, thus tripling their workload. Women choppers and pickers generally earned half as much as their male co-workers. To make matters worse, because husbands and elder sons occasionally migrated to nearby cities or mines to find work, escape family responsibilities, or avoid persecution in one form or another, many women and children in a variety of female-headed households and extended families were left to organize production without the benefit of adult male 5. It was not unusual for a black woman to manage household finances and negotiate the year-end settlements with her landlord. On some plantations, the woman's role as spokesperson was a defensive measure. When a black man appeared to settle his debts, the landlord's wife sometimes negotiated in her husband's place so that if the sharecropper objected to the final agreement, the landlord could accuse him of insulting a white woman. The presence of the sharecropper's wife or eldest daughter in his place mitigated the landlord's ability to construe the dialogue as a violation of 6. Black women were also more likely to be literate and have more formal education than black men. According to the 1940 census, more black women than black men obtained formal education beyond 5 to 6 years. In the Black Belt counties where the illiteracy rate among African Americans was as high as 35 and 40% in 1940, the ability to read and write could determine a sharecropper's success or failure. In several cases, women proved so important as managers that in some families their unexpected death or illness meant total ruin of an already precarious financial situation. As long as mother lived, recall a member of the Sharecroppers Union in Tallapoosa County. She managed some way and kept us in school, but the boss took everything away from father. 7. It is tempting to characterize the Black Belt as a timeless, static, semi-feudal remnant of the post-Reconstruction era, but such an idyllic picture ignores the history of rural opposition and does not take into account significant structural changes that have occurred since the 1890s. Black and white populists waged a losing battle against the expansion of tenancy, and in the wake of defeat, many landless farmers resisted debt peonage with their feet. Drowning in a sea of debt, tenants often broke their contracts, leaving an unsuspecting landowner at a critical moment in the planting cycle. Given the demography of the plantation, open collective rebellion was virtually impossible. Shacks were placed near the edge of the plantation, and 2 or 3 miles often separated tenant families from one another. Therefore, more individualized forms of resistance, theft, arson, sabotage, foot dragging, slander, and occasional outbreaks of personal violence were used effectively to wrest small material gains or to retaliate against unfair landlords. Such tactics were legitimated by folk cultures that celebrated evasive and cunning activities and, ironically, by the dominant ideology of racist paternalism that constructed an image of blacks as 8. Naturally ignorant, childlike, shiftless laborers with a strong penchant for theft. Resistance, in some ways, altered the structure of production as well as the planter's ability to make a profit. With the onset of World War I, for example, large numbers of workers left the countryside altogether to take advantage of employment opportunities in the sprawling urban centers of the North and South. Areas most affected by the exodus were forced to adopt limited forms of mechanization to make up for the dwindling labor force and rising wages. The movement off the land was accompanied by improved roads and the availability of affordable automobiles, which increased rural mobility. The number of automobiles owned and operated by Alabama farmers increased from 16,592 in 1920 to 73,634 in 1930. Smallholders and tenants who acquired vehicles were no longer beholden to the plantation commissary and could now purchase supplies at much lower prices in the nearby urban centers. The revolution in transportation compelled landowners to furnish tenants in cash in lieu of credit lines at plantation commissaries and county stores in an attempt to retain rural labor in the face of competitive wages offered in the cities. But after 1929, cash was a rare commodity, and landowners resurrected the commissary system, effectively undermining their tenants' newly acquired freedom and 9. By the time Birmingham communists established links to the Cotton Belt early in 1931, tenancy seemed on the verge of collapse. Advances of food and cash were cut off, debts were piling higher, and the city offered fewer opportunities to escape rural poverty. Subterranean forms of resistance were by no means abandoned, but groups of black farmers now saw the logic in the CP's call for collective action. The slogan demanding self-determination in the Black Belt did not inspire Birmingham's nascent communist cadre to initiate a rural-based radical movement. The 1930 draft program for Negro farmers in the southern states expressed the Central Committee's doubt as to the ability of black sharecroppers and tenants to create an autonomous radical movement, and a few months later James Allen, editor of the Southern Worker, argued that only industrial workers were capable of leading tenants and sharecroppers because the latter lacked the collective experience of industrial labor. Aside from spouting rhetorical slogans, party organizers all but ignored the Black Belt during their first year in Birmingham. Indeed, their first taste of rural organizing was in northern Alabama among a small group of white tenant farmers who had asked the TEO for help obtaining 10. Then, in January 1931, an uprising of some 500 sharecroppers in England, Arkansas, compelled Southern communists to take the rural poor more seriously. Birmingham party leaders immediately issued a statement exhorting Alabama farmers to follow the Arkansas example. Call mass meetings in each township and on each large plantation. Set up farmers' relief councils at these meetings. Organize hunger marches on the towns to demand food and clothing from the supply merchants and bankers who have sucked you dry year after year. Join hands with the unemployed workers of the towns and with their organizations, which are 11. The response was startling. The Southern Worker was flooded with letters from poor black Alabama farmers. A sharecropper from Waverly, Alabama, requested full information on this fight against starvation and pledged to do like the Arkansas farmers, with the assistance of communist organizers. A Shelby County tenant made a similar request. We farmers in Vincent wish to know more about the Communist Party, an organization that fights for all farmers, and also to learn us how to fight for better conditions. Another, farmer correspondent, had already made plans to get a bunch together for a meeting, adding that poor farmers in his 12. In February, Angelo Herndon was sent to Wilcox County to address a group of sharecroppers who had begun meeting regularly under the leadership of a local black minister. Sensing the group's distress, he elected to stay longer than intended and began organizing a union under the auspices of the United Farmers League. But once authorities learned of his 13. Despite Herndon's experience, district leadership enthusiastically laid plans for a sharecroppers and farm workers union that would conceivably unite poor white farmers of northern Alabama and black tenants and sharecroppers in the Black Belt. An attempt to bring black and white farmers together in a joint conference, however, brought few results. The parties' position on social equality and equal rights alienated most poor white farmers, and within a few months the party's white contacts in Coleman and St. Clair counties had practically dissipated. 14. The CFW was eventually launched in Tallapoosa County, a section of the eastern Piedmont whose varied topography ranges from the hill country of Appalachia in the north to the coastal-like plains and pine forests of the south. In 1930, almost 70% of those engaged in agriculture were either tenants or wage workers, the majority of whom were sharecroppers. Blacks comprised the bulk of the county's tenant and rural laboring population, and while they constituted roughly one-third of the total population, most blacks resided in the flat, fertile southeastern and southwestern sections of the county. As in the Black Belt counties further south, antebellum planter families in these two areas retained political and economic ascendancy, despite competition from textile and sawmill interests. Not surprisingly, the impetus to build a union came from local tenant farmers living primarily in southeastern Tallapoosa County. Estelle Milner, a young school teacher and the daughter of a black Tallapoosa sharecropper, was instrumental in establishing links between black farmers and communist leaders in Birmingham. She laid the groundwork for the party's activities by secretly distributing the Southern Worker and placing leaflets in strategic areas. Two brothers, Tommy and Ralph Gray, contacted the party, persuaded several local sharecroppers to send letters to the Southern Worker, and in early spring invited a communist organizer to help. 15. The Grays were known by their neighbors as a proud family with a militant heritage. Their grandfather Alfred Gray had been a state legislator in Perry County, Alabama, during Reconstruction and a staunch advocate of equal rights as well as a sharp critic of the Freedmen's Bureau. He told a mixed crowd in Uniontown in 1868, "I am not afraid to fight for the Constitution, and I will fight for it until hell freezes over. I may go to." 16. Ralph Gray, who had been nourished on stories of his grandfather, emerged as the fledgling movement's undisputed local leader. One of 15 children, Gray was born in Tallapoosa County in 1873 and spent about 1 year of his adult life working in Birmingham. After returning to Tallapoosa in 1895, he married and settled down as a tenant farmer until 1919, when he and his family left Alabama in search of better opportunities. Having spent some time sharecropping in Oklahoma and New Mexico, he returned to the place of his birth in 1929 and purchased a small farm. Gray owned a plot of land, but it was hardly enough to survive on. Nevertheless, he managed to remain debt-free and purchased his own automobile, thus earning the respect of his local community. Early in 1931, Gray applied for a low-interest federal loan with which to rent a farm from Tallapoosa merchant John J. Langley. Because the loan check required a double endorsement, Langley was able to cash the check and withhold Gray's portion, who then retaliated by filing a complaint with the Agricultural Extension Service. When the landlord heard what he had done, his brother Tommy recalled, he got mighty mad and jumped on Brother Ralph to give him a whipping. Instead, Brother Ralph whipped him. Soon thereafter, Ralph began reading the Southern Worker, joined the Communist Party, and set out with his brother to build a 17. Gray's fight with Langley suggests a growing tension between landlord and tenant, merchant and landowner, each operating in a system more precarious than ever. As conditions deteriorated, the Southern Workers' appeal for collective action became an increasingly attractive alternative to starvation and isolated instances of protest. In April, the Grays' request for an organizer was filled by Mac Code, an illiterate Birmingham steel worker originally from Charleston, South Carolina, who had joined the party in 1930. Following an unsuccessful bid for municipal judge in Chattanooga under the communist ticket, he returned to Birmingham in March 1931 for a 3 or 4 week hiatus and then left for Tallapoosa. 18. Code arrived at the height of an important crisis in rural Tallapoosa. Soon after the cotton had been planted and chopped, several landlords withdrew all cash and food advances in a calculated effort to generate labor for the newly built Russell sawmill. The mill paid exactly the same wage for unskilled labor as the going rate for cotton chopping, 50 cents per day for men and 25 cents a day for women. By mid-May, the Southern Worker reported significant union gains in Tallapoosa County and announced that black sawmill workers and farmers in the vicinity have enthusiastically welcomed communist leadership. The nascent movement formulated 7 basic demands, the most crucial being the continuation of food advances. The right of sharecroppers to market their own crops was also a critical issue because landlords usually gave their tenants the year's lowest price for their cotton and held on to the bales until the price increased, thus denying the producer the full benefits of the crop. Union leaders also demanded small gardens for resident wage hands, cash rather than wages in kind, a minimum wage of $1 per day, and a 3-hour midday rest for all laborers, all of which were to be applied equally, irrespective of race, age, or sex. Furthermore, they agitated for a 9-month school year for black children and free transportation to and from. 19. By July 1931, the CFW, now 800 strong, had won a few isolated victories in its battle for the continuation of food advances. 20. Most Tallapoosa landlords, however, just would not tolerate a surreptitious organization of black tenant farmers and agricultural workers. Camp Hill, Alabama, became the scene of the Union's first major confrontation with the local power structure. On July 15, Taft Holmes organized a group of sharecroppers near Camp Hill and invited Code, along with several other Union members, to address the group in a vacant house that doubled as a church. In all, about 80 black men and women piled into the abandoned house to listen to Code discuss the CFW and the Scottsboro case. After a black informant notified Tallapoosa County Sheriff Kyle Young of the gathering, deputized vigilantes raided the meeting place, brutally beating men and women alike. The posse then regrouped at Tommy Gray's home and assaulted his entire family, including his wife who suffered a fractured skull, in an effort to obtain information about the CFW. Only an agitated Ralph Gray, who had rushed into the house armed, saved them from possible fatal consequences. Union organizer Jasper Kennedy was arrested for possessing 20 copies of the Southern Worker, and Holmes was picked up by police the following day, interrogated for several hours, and 21. Despite the violence, about 150 sharecroppers met with code the following evening in a vacant house southwest of Camp Hill. This time sentries were posted around the meeting place. When Sheriff Young arrived on the scene with Camp Hill Police Chief J. M. Wilson and Deputy A. J. Thompson, he found Ralph Gray standing guard about a quarter-mile from the meeting. Although accounts differ as to the sequence of events, both Gray and the sheriff traded harsh words and, in the heat of argument, exchanged buckshot. Young, who received gunshot wounds to the stomach, was rushed to a hospital in nearby Alexander City while Gray lay on the side of the road, his legs riddled with bullets. Fellow Union members carried Gray to his home where the group, including Mac Code, barricaded themselves inside the house. The group held off a posse led by Police Chief J. M. Wilson long enough to allow most members to escape, but the 22. The posse returned with reinforcements and found Gray lying in his bed and his family huddled in a corner. According to his brother, someone in the group poked a pistol into Brother Ralph's mouth and shot down his throat. The mob burned his home to the ground and dumped his body on the steps of the Dadeville courthouse. The mangled and lifeless leader became an example for other black sharecroppers as groups of armed whites took turns. 23. 24. Over the next few days, between 34 and 55 black men were arrested near Camp Hill, 9 of whom were under 18 years of age. Most of the defendants were charged with conspiracy to murder or with carrying a concealed weapon, but 5 Union members, Dosey Minor, T. Patterson, William Gribb, John Finch, and Tommy Finch, were charged with assault to murder. Although Police Chief Wilson could not legally act out his wish to kill every member of the Reds there and throw them into the creek, the Camp Hill Police Department stood idle as enraged white citizens waged genocidal attacks on the black community that left dozens wounded or dead and forced entire families to seek refuge in the woods. Union Secretary Mac Code, the vigilantes' prime target, fled all the way to Atlanta. But few Tallapoosa communists were as lucky as Code. Estelle Milner suffered a fractured vertebra at the hands of police after a local black. 25. Behind the violence in Tallapoosa County loomed the Scottsboro case. William G. Porter, secretary of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, observed that vigilantes in and around Camp Hill were trying to get even. 26. Rumors spread throughout the county that armed bands of blacks were roaming the countryside searching for landlords to murder and white women to rape. On July 18, for example, the Birmingham Age-Herald carried a story headlined, "Negro Reds Reported Advancing," claiming that 8 carloads of black communists were on their way from Chattanooga to assist the Tallapoosa sharecroppers. In response, about 150 white men established a roadblock on the main highway north of the county only to meet a funeral procession from Sylacauga, Alabama, en route to A. 27. Outraged middle-class black leaders, clergymen, and white liberals blamed white communists for the incident, asserting that armed resistance on the part of black sharecroppers and tenants was unnatural. An investigation conducted by James D. Burton, Tennessee Secretary for the CIC, found irresponsible white groups to be the cause of the conflict, although illiteracy and poverty explained why black sharecroppers were easily influenced by agitators and easily misled in trying to find their way out of their difficulties. Ralph Gray, the one homegrown anomaly, was deemed an exception because he presumably returned from Oklahoma and 28. Hoping to quell black unrest in the area, Robert Rusa Moton, superintendent of Tuskegee Institute, dispatched representatives to Tallapoosa in a calculated move to turn blacks away from communism. Likewise, L.N. Duncan, director of the Agricultural Extension Service based at the Alabama Polytechnic Institute, assured Governor Miller that several black county agents were making a special effort to quiet the people down, urging them to put away their guns and calling their attention to the fact that they are badly misled, by these communistic representatives. The NAACP also made its presence felt, particularly after local authorities tried to implicate the association with the allegation that seized CFW minute books belonged to the Society for the Advancement of Colored People. Walter White and local Birmingham NAACP leaders sharply denied any connection to the communist-led union and accused the 29. While publicly admonishing the communists for Camp Hill, Walter White quietly pursued the idea of providing legal defense for the jailed sharecroppers. He feared that if the ILD entered the case and won an acquittal, the communists would proclaim loudly that mass action had freed the Camp Hill defendants, thus validating the ILD's legal defense strategies. But unlike Scottsboro, the Camp Hill defendants were members of the party's organization. There was no question as to who was going to defend them. Governor Miller and the Dadeville Sheriff's Office received a flurry of telegrams and postcards protesting the arrests and demanding the death penalty for all those directly involved in the murder of Ralph Gray. The ILD further linked this case to the Scottsboro trial, focusing on the exclusion of blacks from Southern juries. Irving Schwab, an attorney for the Scottsboro defendants, secured the release of all but 7 of the imprisoned sharecroppers because of insufficient evidence, and the remaining 7 defendants were later released after their hearings were postponed indefinitely. Prominent Alabama citizens wary of creating. 30. National Communist leadership praised the Union's resistance at Camp Hill as vindication of the party's slogan calling for the right of self-determination. The ILD's defense of the sharecroppers was further proof, they reasoned, of the effectiveness of mass pressure outside the courtroom. But Union organizers found little romance in the bloodletting or in the uprooting of hundreds of poor black farmers that had followed the Camp Hill battle. Moreover, rural conditions in Tallapoosa County had not improved at all. By September, the height of the cotton-picking season, landlords again promised to cut off all food and cash advances after the cotton was picked, and many tenants had to pick cotton on other plantations in order to earn enough to survive the winter. The going rate at the time was a meager 30 cents per 100 pounds, a tiny sum considering the 31. The repression and the deteriorating economic conditions stunted the Union's growth initially, but the lessons of Camp Hill also provided a stimulus for a new type of movement, reborn from the ashes of the old. On August 6, 1931, the 55 remaining CFWU members regrouped as the 32. Throughout 1931, the SCU existed without an organizational secretary. Between August 1931 and early 1932, the SCU's only direct link to the party was a 19-year-old YCL organizer from Springfield, Massachusetts, named Harry Hirsch, who adopted the pseudonym Harry Sims. Sims's role was that of liaison, intermittently carrying information back and forth between district leaders and the SCU locals, which now began to operate with virtually no CP direction. As Sims observed, they were meeting every week in small groups and carrying on the work on their own initiative, even though we have not sent an organizer down there. 33. Tommy Gray continued to organize, but because he was targeted by landlords and local authorities, escaping at least one attempted assassination, it was difficult for him to maneuver. Instead, Gray's daughter, 19-year-old YCL leader Eula Gray, held the movement together during this very critical period. When Sims left for Kentucky in 1931, Eula Gray assumed his role as liaison and served as ad hoc secretary until May 1932. By the time she left the post, the SCU in Tallapoosa County had grown to 591 members organized in 28 locals, 10 youth groups, and 12 women's auxiliaries. 67 members were organized in 9 Lee County locals, 4 of which were based in the town of Nottasulga. Chambers and Macon counties each reported 30 members. As District Bureau member Harry Wicks observed, the croppers themselves are maintaining their organization, and reports are that they are holding meetings regularly without any direction from us, except what this little girl. 34. That Wicks could refer to a 19-year-old woman as a little girl illustrates his underestimation of female leadership, an attitude likely shared by other Bureau members. Ignoring Gray's proven ability and her Tallapoosa roots, District Organizer Nat Ross appointed 25-year-old. 35. What would have become of the SCU if Gray continued as secretary, we will never know. However, Al Murphy proved to be a tremendous asset to the fledgling organization. Recognizing the need to expand beyond the eastern Piedmont counties into the Black Belt, Murphy eventually established headquarters in Montgomery, where he worked closely with that city's 3 leading black communists, Charles Tasker, the leader of the Montgomery Unemployed Councils, his wife, Capitola Tasker, who directed the SCU Women's Auxiliaries, and Montgomery Party leader John Beans. Beans was unique in that he was the only black veteran trade union organizer in the Alabama Communist Party. 36. With Murphy in charge, white CP leaders stopped calling on black sharecroppers to demonstrate in front of the landlord's house and demand that the food advances be continued until the crop is taken in. Besides, local blacks had never taken these suicidal directives seriously. Murphy was well aware of the croppers' underground tradition of resistance, and he developed tactics that emphasized self-preservation and cunning. No meetings were to be held in empty houses, SCU members were not to walk in large crowds, and they were not to engage in armed action without notifying Murphy, unless, of course, it could not be avoided. Everything from their actions to their demeanor drew on subterranean forms of everyday resistance. Ned Cobb, a small landowner from Tallapoosa County who joined the SCU in 1932, was told to act humble, be straight, his teachin', to not go at a thing too rapid and forcible. Be quiet, whatever we do, let it work in a way of virtue. Yet, Murphy's instructions to act humble did not mean abandoning armed self-defense. Members such as Lemon Johnson, former secretary of the Hope Hull Local, believed armed self-defense distinguished the SCU from other organizations. His own experience informed him that the only thing going to stop them from killing you got to go shooting. When Harry Haywood attended an SCU meeting in Dadeville, he was taken aback by what he described as a small arsenal. There were guns, he recalled. Of all kinds, shotguns, rifles, and pistols. Sharecroppers were coming to the meeting armed and left. 37. Lemon Johnson, SCU Secretary of Hope Hall, Alabama, local, photographed in 1986, photographed by author. Murphy decentralized the organization by establishing captains for each local, and like Harry Sims and Eula Gray before him, he kept the locals informed of the situation in other counties. Dues were collected when possible, but most of the funds, never amounting to more than a few cents, were in the hands of the captains. They tended to the day-to-day organizing of the union, the women's auxiliaries, and the youth sections, and those who could write were responsible for sending articles to the party's press detailing conditions in their respective areas. Murphy warned the captains against becoming tyrannical or egocentric with their power. No captain is to act as a boss of his local, he frequently advised. Weekly meetings were supposed to be held, always in absolute secrecy to avoid police raids or vigilante attacks. Minutes were rarely kept because of the potential danger of keeping written records, not to mention the problem of literacy in the Black Belt. Union locals often cloaked their intentions by holding Bible meetings, and some secretaries recorded the minutes by underlining. 38. Black women's contribution to the SCU rarely appeared in the pages of the party press, in part because their strong presence countered an essentially male-centered version of radicalism generated by communist writers and national leaders, most of whom had never worked in the South. Indeed, the party's advocacy of black self-determination conjured up masculine historical figures such as Toussaint Louverture, Frederick Douglass, and Nat Turner, and writers like Eugene Gordon and V.J. Jerome portrayed the movement as a struggle for manhood. Armed resistance, in particular, was deemed a masculine activity. When the central black character, a young Southern-born communist, in Grace Lumpkin's novel A Sign for Cain observed, "Shotguns stacked in the corner of the cabin," he assured his comrades, "We ain't dealing with cowards, but men." For nearly all writers in communist circles, black and white, male and female, the martyred Ralph Gray assumed the symbol of black manhood in the South. Radical poet Ruby Weems published a moving account of the murder of Ralph Gray. The final stanza closing the episode with a great climactic vision. When leading communist theoretician B.J. Jerome introduced his famous poem, "To a Black Man," he referred to the slaughtered blood of Ralph Gray / black-skinned sharecropper of Camp Hill. 39. These ideological constructions distorted black women's role in the SCU, women whose indispensable organizing skills and basic concerns were the foundation of union activity. The tradition of autonomous black women's religious and social organizations served as conduits for the broader movement, and were prototypes for the women's auxiliaries. Frequently called sewing clubs, the women's auxiliaries exercised considerable power within the union. Although they met separately to divert the suspicions of local authorities and, according to observers, so one parent can stay with children when the other is away, the sewing clubs provided forums to discuss conditions and formulate strategy. These women read the Daily Worker, the Southern Worker, and Working Woman when they could get it, and generated a stream of correspondence that linked their local struggles with the national and international movement. Union wives or girls with a modicum of formal education wrote brief descriptive letters to the party's daily and regional tabloids. Usually the result of collective discussion within the union locals, the letters were often scribbled on a 40. These letters seemed to support the contention that women's assigned role in the sexual division of labor, in this case motherhood, lay at the root of women's collective action and radicalization, a manifestation of female. 41. A common theme that runs through most of these letters, as well as speeches by black female communists, is the overall inability of women to feed and care for their families under intolerable conditions. A Tallapoosa County YCL organizer expressed the sentiments of her comrades. "We are tired of seeing our children go naked and hungry, crying for bread. We must raise our voices louder against this. Not only I myself am suffering, but millions of mothers and children are suffering." Speaking before the Women's Congress Against War and Fascism in Paris, Capitola Tasker acknowledged that she joined the movement for the 42. Women's radicalization through female consciousness does not tell us the whole story, however. Party rhetoric at the national level tended to overemphasize the family economy and the oppression of women as mothers because communists constructed a vision of working-class militancy that generally excluded women and thus tended to overshadow. 43. But women joined the SCU as workers and farmers seeking equal wages and better conditions. As a political movement that encouraged women's involvement, at least in rhetoric, the SCU also served as a lever of power since outright repression of women's participation could lead to charges of male chauvinism, an imported phrase that entered some black women's vocabulary via Working Woman and other CP tabloids. Finally, Union and auxiliary meetings provided a needed respite from daily chores and freed women from child care since men were expected to take up the slack during sewing club meetings. Murphy, an unflinching supporter of the party's demand for self-determination in the Black Belt, had very definite ideas about the radical character of the SCU. He saw within each and every member standard-bearers of Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Frederick Douglass, and regarded the all-black movement as the very embodiment of black self-determination. Nonetheless, the SCU received some tacit support from poor white farmers. Once in a while, sympathetic poor white tenant farmers, especially women, attended SCU meetings. In Lyndon Johnson's words, most white tenant farmers wanted this color line broke down better than us do. Some of them be with us in the meetings, the white women. And some of these white men from out here be with us in the meeting, help bringing this thing down. Be telling us some things that half the people crying on to God. Some poor whites were obviously attracted to the SCU's program, but racial divisions in the Black Belt were drawn so sharply that black organizers felt it was too dangerous to even discuss the union with whites. "I'd like to see whites come along with us," admitted one SCU member. "But I ain't gonna go out and ask them. That's too dangerous." Some whites paid a dear price for their sympathy. In 1934, white Tallapoosa tenant farmer J. W. Davis was kidnapped and lynched by vigilantes because 44. Open membership was impossible, but poor whites showed their support in a variety of ways, from providing food and supplies to known union members to hiding activists during crises. 45. Perhaps the most common form of support that allowed individuals to retain their anonymity was voting. In Elmore County, an SCU stronghold, 275 votes were cast for William Z. Foster and James Ford in the 1932 presidential election. Herbert Hoover only received 160 votes from Elmore County. This is an astounding figure when one considers that the all-white electorate was comprised of only 3,641 voters. Overall, 49% of the state's communist vote in 1932 came from Elmore, Crenshaw, 54 votes, and Perry, 33 votes, counties in which the SCU was active. The communists' surprising showing in Elmore, however, might also reflect white farmers' disillusionment with the two-party system. As one frustrated mainstream Democrat declared in 1932, Elmore voters are uncertain about what to do or what they want to. 46. Support was also forthcoming from a small group of white liberals in Montgomery who had formed a Marxist study group during the 1930s. Composed of some of the most prominent and richest people in Montgomery. The largely female group included teachers, social workers, and wives of upper-middle-class Jews interested in world peace and domestic social reforms. Most prominent were Rabbi Benjamin Goldstein, who was regarded by his congregation at Temple Beth or as somewhat of an iconoclast, and Olive Stone, a professor of sociology and dean at Montevallo College, who had traveled to the USSR in the 1920s. Apparently, no one in the group joined the Communist Party, but they provided crucial financial and moral support for communist activities in Birmingham, Montgomery, and the Cotton Belt. Olive Stone, for example. 47. After a year of rebuilding following Camp Hill, the Union emerged stronger than ever. A threatened pickers' strike in 1932 won Union members on at least one Tallapoosa plantation the right to sell their own cotton directly, as well as a continuation of winter food advances. Days after the victory was announced, organizer Luther Hughley was arrested for vagrancy, but soon after he was placed in police custody, he was accused of kidnapping a white woman from Camp Hill. Before a mass campaign could be initiated, however, Hughley was released and threatened with rope and 48. Aside from Hughley's arrest and the aborted pickers' strike, Camp Hill remained rather quiet and uneventful after the cotton had been picked. While most farmers prepared for the coming winter, 5 SCU organizers joined Al Murphy as delegates to the 49. The peace did not last very long. Exactly 2 weeks after the delegation left Alabama for the conference, the SCU in Tallapoosa County once again found itself embroiled in an explosive battle with local authorities. It all started near Reeltown, an area about 15 miles southwest of Camp Hill. The SCU's armed stand centered around the landlord's attempt to seize the property of Clifford James, a debt-ridden farmer who had been struggling desperately to purchase the land he worked. The story actually dates back to 1926, when James borrowed $950 to purchase the 77-acre plot he was working from Notasulga merchant W.S. Parker. The full cost of the land was $1,500. In addition to the borrowed money, James paid $250 in cash and sold $450 worth of timber from his property. Parker then absorbed James's debt by taking out a mortgage on the land. After advancing James money, food, and implements in 1927, Parker sold him 3 mules on credit, which then augmented James's debt to $1,500. James's friend and fellow SCU member, Ned Cobb, was also indebted to Parker. Parker had it in for me, Cobb recalled. He knew I had good stock and I was a good worker and all like that. He just aimed to use his. 50. When the SCU reorganized in Tallapoosa County, its approach to debt peonage attracted James and hundreds of other black farmers. As a result of debates within the Communist Party's National Negro Commission, the SCU added to its core program the abolition of all debts owed by poor farmers and tenants, as well as interest charged on necessary items such as food, clothes, and seed. The SCU's solution to indebtedness had appealed to so many black tenants and small landowners that even W.S. Parker felt the union's policies damaged relations between him and his tenants. The reaction among James and several other Negroes, Parker admitted, who before had shown a spirit of cooperation to the mentioning of foreclosures, seemed to point conclusively that there was some sort of sinister influence at work among them. James threw himself into the movement, becoming a communist and a leader of an SCU local that included farmers from Reeltown and Lee County. 51. Parker blamed this sinister influence for his inability to reach an agreement with James concerning his debts. Unable to come to terms, Parker asked Deputy Sheriff Cliff Elder to serve a writ of attachment on James's livestock. When Elder arrived on December 19, 1932, about 15 armed SCU members were already standing outside James's home prepared to resist or avert the seizure. Although the group challenged established property rights by protecting James's right to retain his livestock in contravention of the law, they tried to avoid a gun battle. Their collective stand differed from the individualized practice of hiding vulnerable items, but the first stages of confrontation remained clearly within the traditional boundaries of rural paternalism. Ned Cobb humbly pleaded with Elder. Please, sir, don't take it. Go to the ones that authorize you to take his stuff, if you please, sir, and tell them to give him a chance. He'll work to pay what he owes them. When Elder and his black assistant officer attempted to seize the animals, humility ceased. James and Cobb warned them against taking the animals, and Elder interpreted their warnings as death threats. Fearing for his life, he left James's farm, promising to return to kill you niggers in a 52. Elder returned a few hours later with 3 reinforcements, Chief Deputy Dowdell Ware, former Sheriff J. M. Gaunt, and a local landlord named J. H. Alfred. Several SCU members barricaded themselves in James's home and others stood poised at the barn. Shots were exchanged almost as soon as the 4 men stepped onto the property, but when Elder's small posse seed that crowd of niggers at the barn throw up their guns, they jumped in the car and fled from the vicinity. Unable to persuade Governor Miller to dispatch state troops, Sheriff Young proceeded to form his own posse, gathering men from Lee, Macon, Elmore, and Montgomery counties. 53. When the shootout was over, SCU member John McMullen lay dead, and several others were wounded, including Clifford James, Milo Bentley, Thomas Moss, and Ned Cobb. Within the next few days, at least 20. 54. Several of those arrested were not involved in the shootout, but their names were discovered when the police returned to James's home and uncovered the SCU locals membership list along with considerable communistic literature. The violence that followed eclipsed the Camp Hill affair of 1931. Entire families were forced to take refuge in the woods. White vigilante groups broke into black homes and seized guns, ammunition, and other property, and blacks were warned that if they appeared in the Liberty Hill section of Reeltown they would be shot on sight. A blind black woman reported to be nearly 100 years old was severely beaten and pistol-whipped by a group of vigilantes, and one Tallapoosa doctor claimed to 55. Despite severe injuries to his back, James managed to walk 17 miles to Tuskegee Institute's hospital. After dressing James's gunshot wounds, Dr. Eugene Dibble of Tuskegee contacted the Macon County Sheriff, who then removed James to a cold, damp cell at the Montgomery County Jail. Milo Bentley, who reportedly had been shot in the head, back, and arms, was also taken to Montgomery County Jail. Observers claimed that Bentley and James received no medical treatment from their jailers and both were found lying on filthy and flimsy blankets on the floor. Cliff James was lying naked on the floor in a separate cage, delirious from the loss of blood and with blood-soaked dirty dressings over those wounds which had been dressed. On December 27, James died from infected wounds and pneumonia, both caused by the lack of medical treatment. 10.5 hours later, Bentley's lifeless body was found in the same 56. About 4 or 5 days after the shootout, the ILD and the SCU in Tallapoosa County held a mass meeting in Camp Hill and elected a committee of 15 to investigate the arrests. The ILD sent attorneys Irving Schwab and George Chamley to Montgomery on behalf of the imprisoned black farmers, but because jail authorities denied ILD representatives access to the prisoners, they had very little information with which to prepare a case. The ILD faced other unforeseen obstacles. Its Birmingham office was ransacked by police, or vigilantes masquerading as law officers, and within hours police arrested several communist organizers. Despite these setbacks, the ILD held a very successful public meeting at the Old Pythian Temple on January 2, 1933, to protest the arrests and to censure Robert Moton and staff members at Tuskegee Institute for their complicity in the deaths of James and Bentley. A few days later, a mass funeral was held for the two martyred Union organizers. Pallbearers carrying two caskets draped with banners emblazoned with deep red hammers and sickles led a procession of 3,000 people, most of whom were black. The mourners marched 6 miles through Birmingham to Grace Hill Cemetery on the southern side of the city, cordoned by an additional 1,000 people who crowded the sidewalks along the route. 57. As more detailed accounts of the shootout reached the press, Tuskegee Institute increasingly became a target of criticism. An elderly Alabama black woman, Abby Elmore Bugg, castigated Moton personally. "Now, if you love your neighbor as yourself," she asked, "why did you not protect those two poor wounded Negro farmers? Why did you let them die? A good enemy, sick, of all races I should say you be, in a time of real need." William MacArthur from Detroit charged Moton and his staff with the murder of Milo, Bentley and Cliff James. "You so-called Negro leaders," he continued, "are nothing but a bunch of traitors. Dirty reformists, sick bootlicking, helping the landlord robbers take the Negro farmers' cotton and land, and other products from them." Although Moton believed all the attacks directed at him and the Institute were communist-inspired, he refrained from blaming the communists for Reeltown. "The recent outbreaks of violence," he explained to one inquirer, "between whites and Negroes in that county are primarily the results of the prevailing tenant system in the South that has long since outlived its usefulness." Yet, while the Institute was sensitive to black farmers' needs, it rejected unionization as a strategy for change. Tuskegee's statistician and expert on rural affairs, Monroe Work, admitted that the Institute's general policy is to discourage. 58. Like the Camp Hill shootout in 1931, white liberals and the Southern press blamed communists for the Reeltown incident. Although a Birmingham Post editorial dissented from other newspapers by discussing the indigenous economic roots of the conflict, the writer still placed considerable blame on party propaganda and black inferiority. It is the ignorance of the Negro which makes him prey to the incendiary literature with which the mailboxes of both white and Negro farmers of Tallapoosa County have been stuffed. It is this literature which transforms him from a law-abiding citizen into one who defies the law. The average Negro in 59. His normal state of mind does not consider firing on officers seeking to carry out the law. Many black middle-class leaders agreed that the menace of communism lurked behind the events at Reeltown. The Atlanta Daily World advised blacks to ignore the communists and instead to battle for our rights legally in the courts and economically through mass-owned businesses. But the black elite was not in complete accord. The Reverend M. Nunn, a black Tallapoosa minister, admitted that he had little support from established black leaders for his campaign against the SCU. As he put it, "I am the only Negro that I know of, working every day with the officers in locating these communist units in this section of Alabama." Some respected middle-class blacks even offered support for the Union. At the height of the crisis, one relatively wealthy black landlord let Al Murphy hide on his farm and 60. The trial of the SCU members illustrates the extent of the Union's popularity in the eastern Piedmont. So many black sharecroppers crowded into the courtroom that Solicitor Sam W. Oliver decided to postpone the trial until the excitement subsided. When proceedings resumed in late April, county officials set up roadblocks outside Dadeville to discourage blacks from attending. Nevertheless, black farmers evaded the roadblocks by traveling through gullies and back roads and filled the courtroom once again. The all-white jury convicted 5 of the 19 SCU members indicted for assault with a deadly weapon. Ned Cobb was given 12 to 15 years, Clinton Moss and Alf White received 10 years each, Judson Simpson was sentenced to a maximum of 12 years, and Sam Moss was 61. The confrontation at Reeltown apparently did not discourage the Union's recruitment efforts. By June 1933, Al Murphy reported a membership of nearly 2,000 organized in 73 locals, 80 women's auxiliaries, and 20 youth groups. New locals were formed in Dale and Randolph counties and in the border town of West Point, Georgia. The Communists also established 62. In other parts of the rural South, those who stood their ground at Reeltown were celebrated in rural folklore, as exemplified in the following verses composed just a few months after the incident and sung by sharecroppers in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Bow down on yo knees, till turkey buzzard get through with you. 63. National Communist leaders regarded the SCU as the finest contemporary example of black revolutionary traditions. The apparent militancy of the burgeoning movement was the proof communist theoreticians needed to justify the slogan demanding self-determination in the Black Belt. But the Union's rank and file, who had little time to theorize about the changes taking place in the rural South, found little to celebrate. Black farmers were organizing primarily for their own survival and for a greater share in the decaying system of cotton tenancy. They might have won the battle to exist, but by late 1933 the SCU faced an additional set of problems when the federal government decided to intervene in the production process. Congress and President Roosevelt attempted to reinvigorate the country's dying cotton economy with the AAA. Conceived in 1933 as an emergency measure, the AAA was supposed to increase the purchasing power of landowning farmers by subsidizing acreage reduction. A year later, the Cotton Control Act and the Gin Tax Act, both sponsored by Alabama Senator John Bankhead, made cotton reduction programs compulsory and added a mandatory tax on the ginning of all cotton above the specified quota. Southern sharecroppers were supposed to receive 1/9 of the 1934-35 benefit checks, but in most cases they received nothing since local planters controlled distribution of parity payments. Moreover, landlords used the Gin Tax Act as a lever to obtain their tenants' cotton. In order to gin cotton without paying the tax, tenants had to obtain gin certificates from their landlords or from local planter-dominated AAA boards. If a tenant refused to give the cotton to his or her landlord to be ginned, the landlord. 64. At first such abuses were commonplace, and a liberal section of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration tried to restructure the distribution process. However, most planters did not have to engage in fraud in order to benefit from New Deal policies. They merely reallocated land, evicted redundant tenants, and applied the cash subsidies to wages rather than sharing it with their tenants. New Deal policies, therefore, indirectly stimulated a structural change in the cotton economy, the mechanization of agriculture. Cotton production remained unmechanized for so long partly because most landlords lacked capital and because the units of production, plots farmed by tenants and sharecroppers, were too small to warrant adoption of expensive technology. Tenancy provided the cheap labor needed to make the transition to mechanization, but it limited production to small, segmented units. By farming larger units of production, landlords could apply the parity payments and savings derived from not furnishing tenants to tractors, fertilizers, and other implements needed for large-scale cotton farming. Local relief administrators helped the landlords by clearing the relief rolls during cotton picking and cotton chopping seasons, thus. 65. As large portions of the 1933 crop were being plowed under, and the first wave of tenants was being evicted, the SCU called strikes on several cotton plantations in Chambers and Lee counties and demanded 50 cents per 100 pounds. The union's first attempted strike since its founding 3 years earlier crumbled, however, when 7 SCU leaders were arrested and posses forced pickers back into the fields. Although the strike failed, thousands of evicted tenants in Alabama began turning to the SCU for assistance. By March 1934, the union claimed 6,000 members and established locals in the Black Belt counties of Lowndes, Macon, Montgomery, and Dallas. The SCU's sudden growth in the Black Belt prompted Murphy to move the underground headquarters from Birmingham to Montgomery. The proliferation of Black Belt locals was directly linked to mass evictions and landlord abuses stemming from the AAA. As Murphy pointed out, nearly half of the SCU's membership was recruited between July 1933 and April 1934. According to one SCU leader in Camp Hill, because of the AAA, the union is taking on new life. The SCU in places where it has been slack is beginning to wake up and people don't. 66. The SCU adopted a variety of methods to deal with landlords' abuses of the parity program. First, because hundreds of evicted tenants and sharecroppers were simultaneously removed from relief rolls and CWA projects so that cheap wage labor would be available for cotton chopping, union organizers fought for immediate relief and tried to persuade federal authorities to investigate local CWA administrators. In February 1934, a group of black women organized a Committee of Action, marched down to the CWA office in Camp Hill, and eventually won partial demands for relief. Tenants and sharecroppers who had not yet been evicted were instructed not to sign the joint parity checks unless the landlords paid their portion in cash rather than use the funds to settle debts. SCU members often refused to give up their rental share of cotton unless they received their portion of the AAA check. The union also convinced some day laborers and cotton pickers to boycott plantations that were considered vicious in their treatment of tenants and sharecroppers. On one plantation in Chambers. 67. Late that summer, the SCU prepared for another cotton pickers' strike in Lee and Tallapoosa counties. With a demand of $1 per 100 pounds, the strike started in mid-September on B.W. Meadows' plantation in Tallapoosa County and soon spread to several large plantations in both counties, involving between 700 and 1,000 pickers. The landlord's first response was to evict the strikers, but because it was the height of the cotton picking season, planters needed all available labor. With the support of local police, the planters turned to force to break the strike. In Lee County, police arrested 7 union members for distributing strike leaflets, and in Tallapoosa, vigilantes shot at least 3 strikers, including a woman party organizer. Pinned to the doors of several suspected strikers' homes was the following message: "Warning, take notice. If you want to do well and have a healthy life, you better leave the sharecroppers." Union. Hooded night riders in Lee County kidnapped and beat SCU. Organizer Commit Talbert, and later in the evening 2 more Lee County sharecroppers were kidnapped, draped in chains, and taken to a nearby swamp where vigilantes threatened to drown them if they remained in the Union. The local sheriff intervened but arrested the shackled black. 68. The Alabama Relief Administration also played a crucial role in undermining the strike. As soon as the SCU announced plans for a cotton pickers' strike, Thad Holt, director of the State Relief Administration, dropped from the relief rolls all able-bodied workers who did not volunteer to pick cotton for wages. Even the State Reemployment Agency in Birmingham relocated several people with farm experience to the cotton. 69. In spite of repression, mass evictions, and the expanded pool of cheap labor, the SCU claimed some substantial victories. On most of the plantations affected, the Union won at least 75 cents per 100 pounds, and in areas not affected by the strike, landlords reportedly increased wages from 35 cents per 100 pounds to 50 cents or more in order to avert the spread of the strike. On Howard Graves Plantation, located on the border of Lee and Tallapoosa counties, Union members not only won the sought-after $1 per 100 pounds, but they forced Graves to raise monthly credit allowances from $10 to $15. Finally, the SCU claimed a small victory on General C. L. Pearson's plantation when about 1,000 sharecroppers and tenants refused to gin their cotton at Pearson's Gin. By taking their cotton to an independent gin in Dadeville, they saved money and prevented Pearson from seizing. 70. The 1934 cotton pickers' strike marked the SCU's first major victory since its birth 3 years earlier. As tales of the Union's stand in Tallapoosa County spread from cabin to cabin, so did the Union's popularity. By 71, the celebration ended abruptly, however, as thousands of families found themselves landless during the harsh winter of 1934-35. The 8,000-strong Union stood helpless in the face of New Deal-induced evictions, and no anti-fascist slogans or demands for self-determination could solve their quandary. Communists, labor, and anti-radical violence. Go down in Alabama, organize every living man. Spread the news all over the lawn, we got the Union back again. This what the Union done? CA 1930s. We ought to handle you Reds like Mussolini does them in Italy, take you out and shoot you against the wall. And I sure would like to have the pleasure of doing it. Birmingham Detective J. T. Moser, 1934. After 3 years of sustained activity, communist-led trade unions remained virtually non-existent in Birmingham's mines and mills. Unlike the urban jobless and rural poor who comprised the party's rank and file, employed industrial workers had much more at stake. Knowing full well that their jobs could easily be filled by desperate soldiers in the reserve army of labor, few could afford to openly associate with communists. But as Birmingham moved deeper into the throes of depression, conditions deteriorated to such a degree that even workers able to hold on to their jobs found it increasingly difficult to survive. In 1931, TCI-owned mines and mills cut wages by 25%, followed by a 15% reduction in May 1932. More devastating for workers, however, were cutbacks in operations that effectively forced large numbers of employees to accept work on a part-time basis. TCI, Sloss Sheffield, and Woodward Iron Company implemented a 3-day schedule in 1931, and some steel workers and miners worked as little as 1 or 2 days per month. 1. Birmingham's industrialists chose to reduce hours rather than lay off the bulk of their labor force in order to retain cheap labor in case market fluctuations created a sudden demand. While some workers found jobs elsewhere, the peculiar structure of the company-owned settlements held most in residence, reducing them to virtual peons of their employers. Whether the settlements were located in an isolated mining community or owned by a steel company in an industrial suburb, they shared numerous similarities. Residents of the company-owned homes were at the whims of their employers. Any challenge to the rules or breach of agreement, written or spoken, could lead to eviction. Because rent was so inexpensive, about $5 or $6 per month in 1930, few workers chose to strike out beyond the company settlement. More importantly, companies generally did not evict workers unable to pay the rent, choosing instead to retrieve back payments through payroll deduction at a later date. The apparent gesture of goodwill had its price. Resident workers living under this arrangement had to work upon request, irrespective of minor ailments or other related problems, and those who failed to show were either threatened or beaten by. 2. Structured along the lines of an armed camp and resembling in some ways South Africa's mining compounds, the company-owned settlements were also intended to insulate workers from outside influences, namely labor organizers. Employers maintained a private police force, paid spies to collect information and monitor workers' activities, and employed every available means to create an impenetrable shield around the community. 3. Company Suburb. Double-tenant shotgun houses line streets just outside Republic Steel Plant in Birmingham. Farm Security Administration photograph, courtesy Library of Congress. In addition to wages and living space, employers used commodities, mainly food, to retain and control industrial workers. The less expensive private grocers were naturally workers' first choice, but most employers paid wages in scrip worth about 60 cents on the dollar, to be used exclusively at the company commissary. Even when workers received direct wages, the availability of credit created a cycle of dependency not easily broken, and miners who resided in isolated settlements had few alternative. 4. Reductions in wages and hours during the early 1930s increased workers' debts to the point where other means of survival were not only necessary but encouraged by employers. Like most Birmingham unemployed, miners and steel workers turned to gardening and keeping livestock, especially chickens and pigs. TCI and other large companies encouraged cultivation by renting land to employees at an incredibly cheap rate and making company-owned mules available for plowing. These worker-owned gardens were cultivated primarily by women, whose presence the company clearly took advantage of as a reservoir of free labor. In communities with few employment opportunities for women, the companies indirectly benefited from the labor of workers' wives and daughters because unpaid household and agricultural work was necessary to reproduce the labor power of male industrial workers. In addition to cultivating gardens, these women canned goods, made clothes, washed dust-stained muckers, worked clothes, repaired homes, and to survive the freezing winters without heat, made quilts. "The houses was as cold as I don't know what," recalls Louise Burns, the wife of a black Alabama coal miner who remembers spending much of her time making quilts, gathering coal, and patching up holes in the walls. "We did all this stuff to help keep things warm and going the best we could. Yeah. We had plenty to do." In some cases, the exploitation of female labor was more direct. Foremen and high-ranking officials often had their laundry washed by workers' wives. 5. Women's unpaid labor and the proliferation of gardens certainly ensured family survival, but these practices also helped the company by mitigating reductions in wages and hours without seriously damaging the social reproduction of labor. In other words, the burden of survival fell increasingly upon the shoulders of women, not as paid workers contributing household income directly, but as unpaid producers whose labor ensured the maintenance of the industrial. 6. For the most part, this tenuous mode of survival, visible mainly in the form of company paternalism, worked against labor activism, especially during the pre-New Deal period. The availability of work, credit, free rent, and land for cultivation instilled a sense of complacency within the labor force, and any rumblings of opposition were quickly crushed by threats, intimidation, or violence. Early in 1930, for example, when no more than a dozen communists roamed the streets of Birmingham, the AFL launched a massive campaign to organize white Alabama textile workers, of whom some 85% lived in company towns. Yet, even with the support of several state political figures, including Governor Bibb Graves, the drive completely failed. Although the campaign was conceived in response to North Carolina's communist-led textile strikes in 1929, opponents harkened back to those very events to depict the conservative AFL organizers as a band of invading agitators, who were coming from the outside to disrupt the 7. The utter failure of the AFL's organizing drive was a foreboding of the communists' first 3 years as labor activists. Aside from intermittent attempts to organize bakery workers and black women employed in 8. Communists concentrated exclusively on building the NMU and the Steel and Metal Workers Industrial Union, both affiliates of the TUL. From its beginnings in 1930 to 33, the NMU failed dismally in Alabama, partly because its dual union tactics were ineffective in a region with no competing labor organizations. In other areas, the NMU sought to attract renegade UMWA members into its own ranks or to build a groundswell of opposition to UMWA leaders. Birmingham NMU organizers, however, had to build an interracial union from scratch. Not surprisingly, their early efforts bore little fruit. Communists barely penetrated the armed mining camps, and following a spate of arrests and beatings by TCI police, the fledgling NMU. 9. The Steel and Metal Workers Industrial Union did not fare much better during the pre-NRA period. In 1931, communist shop units at the Stockholm Pipe and Fittings Company and the U.S. Pipe Shop called for a walkout in response to a general 10% wage cut, but workers ignored the strike call. Yet, the dual union policies proved slightly more effective in steel because of the presence of the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers, a considerably weak craft union that had been in existence since the early part of the century. The communists assailed Amalgamated for practicing racial discrimination and ignoring the unskilled, prompting dozens of black steel workers to protest the union's exclusionary policies. By the time Amalgamated launched its organizing drive under the NERA, complaints from black workers compelled the union to open its ranks, although its president, W. H. Crawford, was quick to explain publicly that 10. Alabama's languishing labor movement was given an unprecedented boost in 1933, when Congress passed the NERA. The provisions established under Section 7A stipulated that in the industries covered under the NERA Code, employees could not be prevented from joining a labor union. Employers also had to pay minimum wage rates and to observe regulations setting the maximum hours of work as well as other employment rules set forth in the NERA for their respective industries. Labor responded with renewed enthusiasm. Only 2 months after the NERA was signed into law, an estimated 65,000 workers joined unions affiliated with either the Birmingham or Bessemer trades and labor councils. The resurgence of industrial labor organization was most apparent in the Alabama coal fields. Under the leadership of Indiana labor organizer and former socialist William Mitch, the UMWA initiated a successful campaign during the summer of 1933 and reorganized Alabama's District 20 within a few months. Despite retaliatory layoffs and evictions, by August 87 locals had been organized throughout the state, and within months. 11. The communists were unimpressed by the NERA, arguing that it was intended to force workers into company unions. Alabama party leaders criticized the act for not covering agricultural and domestic workers and for imposing regional wage differentials, accurately predicting that industrialists would respond by replacing black labor with whites rather. 12. Nonetheless, Birmingham communists responded eagerly to the sudden surge of labor activity, and by mid-1933 organizing the unorganized replaced joblessness as their primary issue. At the PUSA's Extraordinary National Conference held in New York in July, delegates issued an open letter to all members of the Communist Party, calling for an intensification of trade union work. Birmingham communists signaled the new emphasis on organized labor by holding an unemployed and trade union conference 2 weeks before the 1933 elections. Although most of its organizers were arrested before the meeting began, the conference was supposed to be a forum to discuss the labor movement's future and to develop strategies for establishing rank-and-file committees within the unions. The party further highlighted the new line by nominating 2 TCI employees to run for Birmingham's City Commission in the 1933 elections. Mark Ellis, a young, white, trade union organizer and communist candidate for commission president, shared the ticket with black TCI steel worker David James, who ran for associate commissioner. Their campaign platform focused mainly on building the labor movement and securing the right to organize. They continued to advocate more relief and an end to evictions of unemployed workers and vowed to cut the police budget, arguing that it would not only free money for municipal relief projects but reduce anti-labor repression and police. 13. The party's industrial organizing campaign took hold rather quickly. The number of communist shop units in Birmingham increased from 5 to 14 within a few months, and by January 1934 Alabama had 496 dues. 14. In accordance with Central Committee directives, the Alabama cadre also made a greater effort to recruit more whites. While they hoped to draw progressive white industrial workers, what they got was an eclectic mix of hobos, ex-Klansmen, and intellectuals who had been reduced to semi-poverty by the Depression. An example of the latter was Israel Berlin, a 32-year-old Lithuanian-born Jew who held a BS degree from the Alabama Polytechnic Institute. After losing his job as a chemist and failing to secure a commensurate position, Berlin spent much of his idle time studying the economic crisis. Dissatisfied with Republican and Democratic panaceas, Berlin joined the Communist Party in 1933 and 15. Clyde Johnson, ca. 1937, photographed by Dolly Speed, courtesy Clyde Johnson. The local cadre was also infused with talented individuals from outside the South. The New York-born Jewish radical Boris Israel had already gained notoriety in Memphis for leading several unemployed demonstrations and for defending a black man accused of raping a white woman. By December 1933, police and vigilante pressure had forced him to take refuge in Chicago, but he returned south a few months later. Adopting the pseudonym Blaine Owen, he settled in Birmingham in 1934 and resumed his work on behalf of the Communist Party. The addition of Clyde Johnson, a lean, tall, soft-spoken young communist organizer, benefited the industrial campaign immensely. Born in 1908 in Proctor, Minnesota, Johnson was only 15 when the Duluth, Mississippi and Northern Railroad hired him to work during the summers. After 2 years at Duluth Junior College, in 1929 he moved to New York and secured work as a draftsman for Western Electric Company while attending courses at City College of New York. Drawn immediately to the campus left, Johnson emerged as a leading militant at CCNY, was elected national organizer for the NSL, and joined the Communist Party. Accompanied by Don West, a radical Southern preacher and poet who would also join the CP, Johnson was dispatched to Rome, Georgia, in 1933 at the behest of the NSL to assist in a student strike at Martha Berry School. Johnson remained in Rome, helped lead a strike of foundry workers, and briefly organized farmers for the Farm Holiday Association. Harassed, arrested, beaten, and eventually forced to flee the county, he left Rome and headed for Atlanta to replace the incarcerated Angelo Herndon. There he met ILD activist and future wife, Leah Ann Agron. Reassigned to Alabama in 1934, he soon became the party's leading. 16. By the time Johnson and other communists began organizing coal miners in Walker and Jefferson counties, many of the obstacles that had hindered the TUL during the pre-New Deal era no longer prevailed. Communists could now work as an alternative force within existing industrial unions that enjoyed limited support from the federal government. More importantly, the horrible living and working conditions in both the coal and ore mines had effectively nourished labor militancy. Accidental deaths caused by falling rocks, cave-ins, uncontrolled loading cars, or natural gas explosions occurred often, and workers disabled or suffering from lung-related diseases received no benefits. Coal operators avoided responsibility by contracting out work to skilled white miners who would hire their own loaders, blasters, and common laborers. When workers complained about pay rate, hours, or health or safety conditions, company representatives would simply point the finger at the contractor, freeing the large corporate entities from any responsibility while reducing capital outlays to a bare minimum. Another obvious point of contention was the operator's practice of appointing checkweighmen. The checkweighman, whose job was to weigh the loaded cars of coal, frequently cheated the contractor and his workers by adjusting the weight to company imposed. 17. Blacks, who in 1930 constituted 62% of the coal miners in Jefferson County, suffered most under the prevailing system. Not only were blacks paid less than whites for the same work, but operators tended to use wider screens for coal mined by blacks, effectively reducing the tonnage for which they were credited. Nor were black miners paid for dead work, such as post and pre-production cleanup, for which their white coworkers were paid. Occupational discrimination also reduced wages and placed a ceiling on job mobility. While white workers held exclusive rights to positions such as contractor or machine operator, blacks rarely rose above coal loading, pick mining, and other unskilled, often seasonal. 18. Despite William Mitch's commitment to interracial solidarity, UMWA leaders generally ignored the coal industry's peculiar forms of racial discrimination and exploitation. Communist miners, therefore, gained a small following within the union by protesting racial discrimination within the industry as well as in the union. The party abandoned the dual union policies characteristic of the NMU and created rank-and-file committees within the UMWA. These committees raised issues that UMWA leaders refused to address, including barriers to black occupational mobility and the lack of black participation in the union's bureaucracy. And while the UMWA received praise from most black and white liberal observers, not to mention a few rank-and-file communists, for its unequivocal racial egalitarianism, most local and national communist leaders believed the union did not go far enough. Even the UMWA's long-standing policy of preserving the offices of vice president and recording secretary for blacks and president and executive secretary for whites was attacked by a few party theoreticians as another form of segregation because it limited blacks to designated positions and kept them from holding the union's top offices. One communist writer, social scientist and novelist Myra Page, discovered during her tour of Alabama's coal mines in 1934 that blacks comprised only one-third of state convention delegates, yet they made up the majority of union membership. As one white UMWA official told her, "We give niggers 1 out of 3 on committees, keep them satisfied and white man control sick." Nevertheless, most black communists who toiled in the mines for a living were not as quick to criticize the union, especially since blacks served as treasurers in several locals, and in a few cases became 19. The rank-and-file committees continued to push UMWA leadership to adopt more egalitarian racial policies, but early in 1934 another issue caused even greater internal dissension within the union. William Mitch accepted the NRA's minimum wage code, which paid Southern workers less than Northern workers. Southern coal operators rationalized lower wages by arguing that unusually high freight rates and the lower grade of Alabama coal pushed production costs relatively high. The regional wage differential sparked a militant, communist-led opposition movement within the UMWA only months after its resuscitation, culminating in an unauthorized strike in February. Defying the decisions of the NRA Regional Labor Board and the UMWA, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 miners walked off their jobs demanding higher wages, union recognition, and the abolition of the wage differential. When Mitch ordered the miners back to work, the communist unit at the Lewisburg mine responded by calling for greater rank-and-file control and adding demands that drew attention to the most exploitative aspects of the miners' life and work. Party leaflets littered the mining camps advocating, among other things, a basic day rate of $1 above the prevailing NRA code, a minimum tonnage rate, equal work, and unfettered occupational mobility for black miners, an 8-hour day, free transportation to and from work, and a drastic reduction in commissary prices. Mitch temporarily settled the strike on March 16, but the strikers had to agree to limit union recognition to a voluntary checkoff system, freeze all strikes until April 1, 1935, and accept prevailing wages. Nevertheless, the negotiations resulted in two significant concessions: the abolition of the 20. The uneasy peace between coal operators and the UMWA did not last very long. In a surprising move, the NRA raised the minimum wage for southern bituminous coal miners by $1.20, nearly equalizing the northern-based minimum, but following a federal injunction obtained by Alabama coal operators, the code was reduced to a 40-cent raise. Consequently, the operators rejected the modified code as well, thus provoking some 14,000 coal miners to walk off their jobs in April against William Mitch's wishes. Communists convinced workers at Dosena and Hamilton Slope mines to leave their jobs, organized pickets at the TCI-owned Wylam and Edgewater mines, and led a group of steel workers to Republic Steel's captive coal mines and persuaded miners there to join the strike. In addition to protesting the wage differential, the party called for an end to the operators' practice of deducting relief payments and back rent from the miners' paychecks, thus drawing attention to the links between housing and welfare policies and workers' dependence on the company. The April walkout marked the height of party influence in the Alabama coal fields, a fact that did not escape the attention of William Mitch. He not only blamed radical elements for instigating the unauthorized strike but encouraged UMWA officials to work with company police to keep communists out of the mines. The strike was eventually broken and most of the strikers either. 21. The party exercised even greater influence within the International Union of Mine, Mill and Smelter Workers, a union comprised mainly of iron ore miners and a handful of steel workers. Originally an outgrowth of the Western Federation of Miners, a militant union that helped launch the IWW in 1905, Mine Mill developed a national reputation as a radical, left-wing union during the 1930s. The prominent role communists played in Mine Mill can be partially attributed to the fact that, in 1933, 80% of the district's ore miners, and an even greater percentage of the union, were black. Indeed, black workers, many of whom had gained experience in the communist-led unemployed movement, held the majority of middle and low-level leadership positions within the union. George Lemley, whose father was an organizer for Mine Mill, recalled, "When the union went in, some blacks thought they would rule the company. Everything will go our." 22. Meat for the Buzzards. Cartoon depicting the National Recovery Act's role in undercutting Alabama coal miners, Daily Worker, 1934. When Jim Lipscomb, a Bessemer lawyer and former miner blacklisted for union activities, initiated Mine Mill's organizing drive in 1933, the prevalence of black workers and the union's egalitarian goals gave the movement an air of civil rights activism. Union meetings were held in the woods, in sympathetic black churches, or anywhere else activists could meet without molestation. Company police used violence and intimidation in an effort to crush Mine Mill before it could establish a following, but when these tactics failed, officials exploited racial animosities. TCI created a company union, the ERP, which used racist and anti-communist slogans to appeal to white workers. Mine Mill quickly earned the nom de guerre, Nigger Union, and white workers who repudiated the ERP were labeled communists and nigger lovers. Officials also cut social welfare programs and enforced segregation codes much more stringently than. 23. In addition to building rank-and-file committees, some communists were elected to leadership positions within their local. As one Mine Mill organizer explained in 1934, the party had even greater influence and stronger organization among the ore miners than any other industry. Communists were frequently identified openly at union meetings, and in many cases, earned the endearment of black union members because of the party's commitment to racial equality and civil rights. High-ranking white Mine Mill officials, on the other hand, shared mainstream labor leaders' disdain for communists. Leaders of the Brighton Local, for example, endorsed a resolution that read, "We are opposed to and do not tolerate communism, and will not accept the application of any man for membership, who is tainted with its poison." A few months later, the president of Bessemer's Local 1 expelled white communist John Davis and two black communists, Nathan Strong and Ed Sears, solely because of their 24. Prodded by the rank-and-file committees, local Mine Mill leaders issued a strike call in May 1934 to ore miners at TCI, Republic Steel Corporation, the Sloss Sheffield Iron and Steel Company, and the Woodward Iron Company, demanding higher wages, shorter hours, and union recognition. The companies refused to arbitrate and responded by firing and evicting dozens of union members. Violence between strikers and company police left 2 strike breakers dead and at least 9 workers wounded. Despite the intervention of state troops, bombs exploded and gunfire was exchanged intermittently throughout most of the summer. 25. During the strike, communists devoted most of their energy to publicizing anti-union violence in the ore mines, fighting evictions, and securing relief for the strikers. Communists created miniature unemployed committees within mine mill that were instrumental in preventing several evictions, fighting for the strikers' right to receive public relief, and maintaining picket lines. In Bessemer, Clyde Johnson obtained much-needed assistance for striking miners from the city's relief authorities and secured crucial support from the otherwise conservative Bessemer Central. 26. With the intervention of Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, an agreement between mine mill and TCI was finally reached on June 27, though it was hardly a victory for the union. Mine mill remained unrecognized, and wages increased only slightly. The communists not only found the bargain unacceptable but pointed to blatant examples of anti-union discrimination and numerous instances of company noncompliance with the agreement. At the Raymond mine, for example, only 60% of the strikers were rehired while the other 40% were summarily fired and evicted. Party units at Muskota mine adopted the slogan, "No union miners move, all scabs off Red Mountain," and communists active at a Sloss Sheffield mine threatened to lead an unauthorized strike over the 27. Mine mill also led a small strike of steel workers at Republic Steel Corporation. Urged on by the Communist Party unit in Republic's East Thomas blast furnace, an estimated 400 workers walked off their jobs in April and demanded a flat 20% wage increase and union recognition. A handful of communists in mine mill attempted to extend the strike by marching on Sayrton coal mine in order to persuade the captive miners to join them, but they were intercepted by a squadron of company police. Vance Halblich, a young white steel worker, was gunned down, and communist Mark Ellis was badly beaten. The Republic strikers eventually won an employee representation election conducted by the Atlanta Regional (NRA) Labor Board 1 month later, but the company would not recognize the union, and the NRA did not have the power to enforce the ruling. Consequently, the Thomas blast furnace workers 28 remained on strike for over a year, receiving far more criticism than support from organized labor. Besides some feeble attempts on the part of the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers, the dying craft union that had been temporarily reinvigorated by the NRA, the steel industry in the Birmingham district remained unorganized until the CIO came into being a few years later. Through the use of lockouts, company unions, intimidation, and the exploitation of racial divisions within the labor force, Birmingham's steel industry effectively hindered labor organization in the mills. The communists placed much of the blame squarely on the shoulders of Amalgamated's local leadership, particularly its president, W. H. Crawford. Crawford opposed rank-and-file sentiment to join the 1934 strike wave, denounced the Republic Steel strike, and all but ignored black workers. Communist labor organizers agreed that the union's success depended on black workers who, in 1930, made up 47% of the labor force in 29. Rather than wait for a policy change in Amalgamated, communists sought to organize metal workers autonomously by establishing federal locals chartered through the AFL's national headquarters. Clyde Johnson was instrumental in forming federal locals in 4 shops, 3 of which signed collective agreements with their employers. At the Virginia Bridge and Iron Company, Johnson struck a bargain with employers only after leading a dramatic one-day walkout and plant shutdown. At the Central Foundry in Tuscaloosa, communists chartered a federal local with over 500 workers after the segregated International Molders Union denied. 30. The communists certainly made their presence felt among miners and steel workers during the 1934 strike wave. Yet their actual contribution remained essentially behind the scenes, partly because most Union communists were black, unskilled, rank-and-file workers. Although individuals such as Henry O. Mayfield, Joe Howard, and Eb Cox would rise within the ranks of the CIO during the late 1930s, the majority of blacks, communist or not, had few opportunities for advancement within the labor movement. Another, often overlooked reason for the party's behind-the-scenes role in the 1934 strike stems from the fact that many rank-and-file organizers were the wives and daughters of black industrial workers, and/or they were women who had joined the CP through the neighborhood relief committees. With the open encouragement of the rank-and-file committees, women's auxiliaries were formed in virtually all working-class communities. Frequently led by communists or ILD activists, the women's auxiliaries sometimes rivaled union locals in membership as well as in their strident advocacy of labor organization. The growth and radicalization of the women's auxiliaries were certainly linked to the increasing workload of black women in the company-controlled communities, induced, of course, by cutbacks in wages and hours. Henry O. Mayfield recalled that whenever union members failed to recruit a recalcitrant worker, the women would send a committee to talk with the worker's wife or the worker and they would always win their point. One white coal miner suggested that the presence of black women ensured the union's success. "Not a scab gets by him," he observed. "Just let one of their race try it. Why, their women folks handle him." Workers' wives used a number of methods to handle their menfolk, such as withholding labor and sex, which might be described as a kind of domestic strike. In a telling commentary, one examiner explains, "Women's can just about rule men's, things like that, to keep them from going back to the company or something another like that. 'Cause all of them was union. A man got a wife, and if he going back to the company, and she didn't want him to go, then she'll say, if you go back, then me and you ain't going to be husband and wife no more." The women's auxiliaries also provided crucial material support during strikes. Ironically, the gardens women cultivated with the encouragement of the company, ultimately intended to offset wage reductions, became a source of strikers' relief. Coal miner Cletus Burns remembers several strikes during which union members would give sweet potatoes, corn, and anything out the garden that they had. When the gardens proved inadequate, according to Mayfield, the women would organize into groups and take baskets and go into stores asking for food for 31. The disturbances in the coal, iron, and steel industries represented merely the apex of a year-long labor revolt. In February, nearly 1,500 Birmingham laundry workers struck for wage increases. 250 packing house workers walked off their jobs in May, and wildcat strikes, some of which had been coordinated by communist organizers, exploded on several New Deal relief projects. Alabama also felt the impact of the West Coast waterfront strikes, which drew a few hundred mobile longshoremen into the fray, and some 23,000 Alabama textile workers joined the national textile strike. In all, the state experienced at least 45 strikes involving 84,228. 32. In spite of the party's emphasis on industrial unionism, Alabama communists did not entirely withdraw from organizing relief workers and the unemployed. In Tarrant City, an industrial suburb of Birmingham, the party founded the RWL in 1934. Led by white communist C. Dave Smith, a veteran labor organizer and dynamic speaker who, according to Clyde Johnson, had guts and was quick with his fists. The RWL was quite popular among Tarrant City workers and even enjoyed support from Mayor Roy Ingram. Mainly through the work of Smith, Clyde Johnson, and local communists Penny Parker and Jesse Owens, Tarrant City became the 33. Communists tried to organize black relief workers in the CCC, a New Deal agency created to relieve poverty and train youth in forest conservation work. From the outset, protests over the working and living conditions were commonplace in the segregated camps, and several CCC workers were placed under observation for allegedly spreading damaging propaganda. In February 1934, a few YCL activists organized a strike of about 200 black CCC workers in a camp near Tuscaloosa. What began as a peaceful protest erupted into violence when state troops intervened and strikers retaliated with a barrage of bricks. Once the fighting subsided, CCC authorities promptly fired about 160 workers and had YCL activist Boykin Queenie, the strike's leader, arrested. The Communist Party, along with the discharged strikers, issued a statement demanding Queenie's 34. Communists played no significant part in the Alabama textile strike. Because the party had not organized in Huntsville, the heart of the state's textile industry, the district committee sent flying squadrons of organizers that drove through mill towns at night and littered the area with leaflets. Aside from sloganeering, the party made no sustained effort to organize the Alabama textile mills. Besides, its predominantly black cadre would have had a difficult time trying to convince white, often racist textile workers to cast their lot with the communists. Not surprisingly, the communists could 35. Only claim considerable influence among the Negro textile workers in Birmingham. On the Gulf Coast, the party's diminutive role can be attributed